And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to be here with everyone for a special New Year's broadcast. And I am joined by Gigi Young.
Hello, everybody.
Gigi, it's great to have you here. And I am also joined by I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
Fantastic. Happy New Year to everyone. This is a very special episode. And we wanted to start 2020 off on this mystery school note, and no better way to do that than with Gigi. And what we're going to do actually with this X series episode 76 is we're going to go deep into the mystery school and mystery mind of Rudolf Steiner and his deep cosmology about Ahriman and the eighth sphere. Now, we've covered these things at times on the show. It's kind of a foundational when you're looking at this X-steganography and the mystery school's profile to include Rudolf Steiner, who really, his anthroposophy coming out of theosophy gives us that whole setup for the 21st century understanding of the mystery schools. And in fact, if you look at the track record, it is anthroposophy that has stood up the best. Although at times in a very stealth fashion. So we're going to start the show off with having Gigi read a little something about what this era is all about, straight from Rudolf Steiner.
Okay, so here we go. The will is there to harness human energy to mechanical energy. These things should not be treated by fighting against them. That is a completely false view. These things will not fail to appear, they will come. What we are concerned with is whether in the course of world history, they are entrusted to people who are familiar in a selfless way with the great aims of earthly evolution and who structure these things for the health of human beings, or whether they are enacted by groups of human beings who exploit these things in an egotistical or in a group egotistical sense. That is what matters. It is not a question of what, in this case, the what is sure to come. It is a question of the how one tackles these situations. The what lies simply in the meaning of earthly evolution, the wielding together of the human nature with the mechanical nature will be a problem of great significance for the remainder of earthly evolution.
Fascinating. That is Rudolf Steiner from 1909, a very important lecture. Gigi, that's powerful. It speaks very much for the era that we're in.
Yeah, it really is. There's so many different elements to it. I mean, I think it's one of those things where you can read several different times and you can get something out of it.
Absolutely.
But I love how he says, harness human energy to mechanical energy. So it's sort of like taking this organic human energy into like a more mechanical energy. It's kind of like, what are we creating? What are we manifesting?
Right.
What are we making real? And then there's this AI component to it, or transhumanism component, or harmonic component is real mechanics, real technology. And then the other thing that really stood out to me was the egotistical human beings who exploit these things in an egotistical or a group egotistical sense.
That's it.
So there's people who create from an egotistical sense where it's like, might is right, this is what I want to create. And then there's people who combine their energy, combine their human energy, and then they create things from that space as well, from an egotistical. So it's not just like individuals being egotistical, you can be a group and be coming from there as well.
Right. And an egotistical group is very dangerous. An individual who leads a group who's egotistical is very dangerous. We've seen a lot of cults in this field. We see them left and right. And this is a very important point because he's saying you have to be guided by this higher ethic going in, or else you're basically creating a Frankenstein monster.
Well, you do. I mean, when people hear about ethics and virtues, those are actually a technology. Those are actually the way that a human being acts when they become exalted. That's just how you act when you're connected to your spirit and you realize that we're all interconnected.
Right.
And you naturally kind of act that way in society. But when you don't have that, then you're thinking that you're a god, not that you're part of God, but that you are that. And that is a danger. That is the ego.
The spiritual space is a magnet for those types of attitudes, in fact.
It is, because it's people in this day and age where we have sunk very, very deeply into scientism and into materialism. The spirit is very far away and almost forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so we forget how it feels in our body. We forget what it's like. And there's a purpose to that. That's not an evil process. There's a purpose to that. There's a purpose to awakening. There's a purpose to that. But there are people who will prey upon the fact that people are sleeping, and they want that energy, and they want to harvest it and exploit the fact that people are sleeping because maybe they have a little bit more knowledge. And so they'll create those cults and basically, exploit people.
It's fascinating because it's kind of like a drug dealer setting up shop in your neighborhood, in a sense.
It's exactly like that.
And then what does the community do when faced with drug dealers pulling on into the neighborhood? It's a very good question.
Well, I think that the spiritual community and spirituality needs to be treated like every other vehicle of society. Things need to be handled through debate and through discussion. And the idea that we just shouldn't look at that or that we should be passive towards that is toxic. It is toxic. And we need to, I think that there's a trend in spirituality to almost go a little bit too Eastern with things. And it's just to completely think that you can disconnect from the physical world and somehow things will just be taken care of. And there's no respect for the fact that there is a point where we do have to transform things. There is a point when we have to go into the physical world and create and transform, which is more of a Western tradition. So there's a weird point in spirituality where some people, I think, are leaning a little Eastern and a little inward, thinking that things will just be solved and I'll just go inward and just observe. And that's beautiful practice, but it doesn't really help in the times that we're in. That's a different time. That's a building time, a recognition time, a foundation time. I hope
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what it reminds me of is the term that's coming to my mind is the surrender of authority. Right. This is what we see over and over again. We see it with people in the pharmaceutical companies. We see it in the political process. In the spiritual field, everywhere you turn, people are just turning over their authority and in a really kind of like cheap fashion we see a number of these movements where the teachings and the marketing and stuff are very polished, but the teachings themselves are flyaway. I mean, they really have no substance.
No, and they're not integrated in the teachers themselves. You have these, these teachings that are basically, they're often stolen. I mean, if we're being completely honest about cults, they're stolen from other people. And they just regurgitate them because there's no creativity. When you are, ego-driven, there's actually no creativity in you. There's no genius, right? But there's this huge desire for power, though. So you steal those things. So they're really just stolen ideas. And then they're hoping that there's people that are kind of like just below them that they can, basically spiritually damage. Mm-hmm. It takes a long time for people to come back to their spirit when they've been betrayed.
No question. We see it in the microcosm and the macrocosm. I mean, you think of something like the Catholic Church has gone through this process where they surrendered all this power to the priests, and then they found out through these 90s scandals in the last 20 years that they had tremendous problems with abuse. on it. And this gives us some idea about the new standard that needs to come into our own mind when we think about these things.
Oh, yeah. We need to question, and we need to understand that any spiritual teacher, any institution is not greater than you, and we need to not give our power away and realize that if, DJ says something that resonates with you, or I say something that resonates with you, it resonates because it was already in you. And we forget that these processes, everything is already inside of us. And it comes out when we're in the right energy, or we hear the right thing. It's innate, and we've forgotten that it's innate, and that's a problem. But that's why we can, pick up a book and we can read a passage in it. And then we can pick it up a week later and read the same passage and get something new. That's miraculous. And that shows how we are naturally pulling and creating our perspective, but we're also naturally spiritual and getting the messages we need. So we don't actually need these figures. We just need to connect with ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Fascinating. Everyone, we're here with Gigi Young. We're off to a running start here with X Series episode 76. And this one is on Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic, philosopher, professor, biodynamic farmer, eurythmy teacher. This guy, unbelievable, Gigi. It seemed like he lived 5 incarnations in one.
He did.
No question. I'm going to go with this quote. This is my Steiner quote to start off our 2020. And this comes from a lecture series closer to the end of his life in 1921, and he died in 24. And those lectures have an interesting quality because you can see this buildup of these lectures up to World War I, and then after World War I, there's a little more sense of we need, it's like his own process is accelerated in some level. But we'll start with this quote. We must eradicate from the soul all fear and terror of what comes towards man out of the future. We must acquire serenity in all feelings and sensations about the future. We must look forward with absolute equanimity to everything that may come, and we must think only that whatever comes is given to us by a world directive full of wisdom. It is part of what we must learn in this age, namely, to live out of pure trust without any security in existence. Trust in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. Truly nothing else will do if our courage is not to fail us. And let us seek the awakening from within ourselves every morning and every evening, unquote. Gigi, it's the trust without any security in existence.
That's faith. Yeah. That's what it is. That's the test.
What'd you think of that one, Olivia?
Well, you read that to me earlier today, and it just, pow, that's exactly where we are right now, this time.
It is. I think that really, those two quotes kind of set it up nicely, because the first one is talking about where, how we're going to move into this process. And then this one is kind of like, once you get there, you have to be fearless. And I like this sense of fearless, because so many things that we find when we look through history, when people were controlled by fear, they would make mistakes. They would do the wrong things. They would trigger themselves. They would belittle themselves. They would belittle others. And this is very interesting, because fear is still not very well understood. There's a lot of kind of politically correct stuff around fear, like, don't get anyone upset and run into a safe space. But that's not the same thing. We're talking about deep-rooted fear connected with this idea of the disconnection between these physical, mental, and spiritual components in a person's life.
Yeah, and if what he's kind of saying, is if we were all clairvoyant, and if we all had those abilities back, we would see that we were surrounded by so much light and so much help. And we walk around blind to this. And so it's only taking the risk and the courage to begin to say, hey, okay, I'm going to start living this way, and I'm going to start coming from that place of serenity. And then you allow the veil to thin every morning or every evening, and you progressively allow that veil to thin and prove itself to you, because spirit and angels, angelic presences, they will prove themselves to you if you let them in. It's not like there's no interaction. They will do that. But if you have fear in your body, that will break up your energy like a wood chipper. And you won't be able to even begin that journey if you have fear. You actually begin to funnel your energy into a complete other reality. Because we're not supposed to worship death. We're not supposed to worship fear. And whatever we think all the time and feel all the time and live in all the time is worship. Mm-hmm. So we're not really supposed to worship death, because fear, in a way, is letting us know what needs to die within us. It's letting us know when rebirth is coming. And so we're not meant to live in that. We're just meant to use that. When you start living in that all the time, you're worshiping that, and that leads you to another sphere. Eventually, that leads you to another place, and that's not where you want to go. So emotions and feelings and thoughts are either ladders up or ladders down, or they're creating certain states that allow us to open certain portals. And whether you're spiritual or not, that's what's going on. So.
Right. Well, there's so much in the mystery school training about thoughts are things. And in some cases, they say as real as a pin in the hand. Can we get our heads wrapped around that?
What was it? A what in the hand?
As real as a pin in the hand.
A pin in the hand? That's pretty real.
It's problematic.
Yeah, dangerous.
So it is kind of fascinating when we look at it. And there's another thing about the density of the period of time that we're in, that our thoughts create things faster. This is another piece of it, which is why it's particularly important, the types of thoughts we generate. Now, we're in a kind of environment, Gigi, where we wake up and we see that, the Iranian militias have invaded the Iraqi embassy in the U.S. We read about the nuclear arms race being back on. We read about 5G flying in with very little resistance. We read about vaccines being poured down everyone, on every community without a whole lot of resistance going on. And there, we're sort of looking at these different things and the different fights that are out there. So it's easy in a sense to get yourself mentally wrapped around this and sort of running in circles. At the same time, these points are all important, but how does somebody, Gigi, going into this not become overwhelmed by the sheer number of changes that are taking place that could go in a negative direction?
Fantastic question.
Well, it is a great question.
That's a good vote. I like that.
I think the first thing is to acknowledge that this is the time that we're in. It's a challenging time, because if there's this belief that we shouldn't experience challenge, that's not going to help you. You're always going to feel like life is happening to you. You don't want to be in the place where, life is happening to you. You want to be like, okay, this is, orient yourself in the moment and say, this is where we are. And then learn how to read your energy. So if you are tired, if you are hungry, if you are spiritually exhausted, mentally exhausted, do not expose yourself to very negative things about society. You have to know that if we want to address these things, we have to take care of ourselves and fill ourselves up with serenity, as Steiner says, and light, and be in the actual mental, emotional, physical state to handle it. Part of this whole agenda, too, is to be exhausted and overwhelmed. So be careful that you're not overwhelmed. It can be like, I know that you mentioned recently about fear porn. And just constantly being addicted to that, and
right.
Watch for that, because people are like the drama are, so we have to be honest with ourselves about where we are emotionally, mentally, and know that if we want to have any chance at changing anything, it has to come through a place of serenity.
It's so fascinating that you're talking about this, because I did quite a survey during this holiday week of all the different blogs and all the channels that are out there. And I like to do that when I have a chance to catch up. And I was shocked by the amount of fear porn that was out there, and people really laying it on thick, and how much all the information is very similar across these corridors, and can be very politically, in a sense, they're all slanted in the same direction politically. And how that polarizing politics also creates this environment. But one of the things that caught me was I was thinking of the people who were agitating people for one political thing or another, and this went left and right, of course. And there's this amazing story about Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, where, Ouspensky is this Russian intellectual, in a sense, and Gurdjieff, being this teacher from the mystery schools, coming in and, knowing that Ouspensky really wants the real deal, but he's surrounded by these people who are kind of the intelligentsia of the time. And some of them were agitators. This is leading up to the Russian Revolution. So, Ouspensky saying to Gurdjieff, look, you need to take this person seriously and this person seriously, and Gurdjieff saying they're not, they literally are living through the people that they're attracting into this negative energy. And he said, I'll show you. Bring one of them over who you think is totally sincere about his political cause. So Ouspensky brings this guy over, and the guy comes in and sits down, and he's like, we're going to have a war about this. We're going to go after these people, and the proletariat's going to rise up and all this stuff. And Gurdjieff said, I want to introduce this technique. I just want to hypnotize you and put you in a light state so we can get you, I want to do this with Ouspensky to show him how this is done. So they hypnotize this guy, who's this incredible agitator. And he says, Gurdjieff has, a number of methods from the mystery schools. And he sits down and he says, what is it you actually want when you talk about all these political things? What is it you're really looking for? And he finds out that the guy has an intense need for sugar, of all things, and that the guy is obsessed with sugar and different types of ways that he can get sugar and get himself into this state, and that he gets the same feeling from getting people agitated, the 2 minutes hate, getting people into this kind of warped state of negativity as he gets when he is on this sugar high. So,
well, it's kind of like an adrenaline rush, right?
Yes, exactly. So he's really hooked. So when I was going through a lot of these YouTube channels and I was thinking about this, and then I was looking at the mainstream media, I was like, they literally have created this weird addiction, and they're addicted to it themselves. It's like this process feeding into each other, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the reality, the everyday reality that we're facing. I mean, we get into this thing where people want to talk about Joe Biden, and they make the good points about his complete, lack of ethics with regard to his past. But then it's like nonstop, round and around and around. And then it's nonstop. It's 2 minutes hate on the next person. And on the other side, they're doing it with Trump, and they want to know everything about Trump. They say Trump is afraid of walking downstairs. So it gets into this thing, and we're supposed to pay attention to it like it's important. And it reached a real climax around a couple of days before New Year's here. And I looked in and I saw in Twitter, their headline was Sharon Stone rejoins Tinder or something like that. That was of all the things in the
I was wondering myself whether she was on, like
she's back, baby. And that's the top news. And I was like, this is it. Twitter's not reality, but this is what they're doing with those social media controls, which is they're giving us a way to think about things, and there's no depth to it. And you and I may be able to spot it to a certain degree, and people who watch the show could watch it. But you can imagine people just catching on to this and just starting to absorb different media forms, and get into the idea of, hey, I'm online and all this stuff is happening. In fact, they are completely numbing out their natural faculties for observation.
They really are. And it's like, we're supposed to be facing our shadow right now. Like, that's the phase that we're in, is we're supposed to be facing our individual shadows, but also our societal shadow and our collective shadow, which is corruption. And so it's almost like all of these Twitter battles and social media is a false experience of addressing the shadow. It's a false feeling of doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, but you're not doing it. So we're supposed to be actually, talking about corruption. We're supposed to be talking about all of these different things across many different avenues of society. But this is keeping us busy and making us think and feel like we're actually getting something done, like we're actually really addressing the shadow, but we're not.
Right.
And part of it is actually civility. The way that we're doing it also is so uncivil at times. It's fine to whatever, pow pow, or, you know, that's but like, you know, hey, but you know, like, but like overall we're so uncivil with each other and disrespectful with each other that it's hard to actually discover what is light and what is dark when everybody is dealing with actual corruption so darkly. And so I think I'd love to see people actually have dialogues and conversations in a respectful manner, because that's the only way we're going to be able to, you know, address anything.
It is. The civility is actually a way to exchange ideas, even with people who are on opposing sides. And, you know, when people deflect that they have a lot to hide, when they run from that, when they can only use that. I mean, you had an experience like this, I have to mention, which is you were like, I want to talk about all the things that have gone on in relation to some of these cults. And, you know, the Corey Good cult came up and he entered into the thread that you were in. And instantly, I mean, this was a TKO within a minute and 45 seconds. This guy ran out of the exchange with you. But what was fascinating is in that short period of time, he tried to intimidate you and say, well, I'm going to, you know, launch lawsuits and you're going to get mixed up in it and boom, boom, boom. It was pretty obvious that he couldn't exchange any real ideas with you. Actually, it's the fastest I've seen him run off anything.
Yeah, well, actually, it was funny because I woke up in the morning and literally I looked at my phone and Corey was, you know, messaging, and I thought he was actually talking to me, but it turns out he wasn't actually addressing my thread. He was talking to somebody else that had commented on my thread. So I thought he was actually engaging in a dialogue with me, but he was actually choosing people that were very angry and choosing to engage with them, I think. And yeah, everything that I wanted to discuss, if you want to, you know, talk about spirituality all day long and politics, that's fine. But if you want to claim divine right and Messiah status, then I have a problem with that.
Oh yeah.
So, and so, you know, if you want to do that, you have to engage in debate from the spiritual community and from whatever other communities you're claiming divine right from. And the reason for that is that you can prove yourself. And if, you know, and everything that came back was basically, you know, I'm going to be in jeopardy and I'm satanic.
Right.
And I'm part of a satanic alliance that now I am.
Right.
Now I am. I wasn't before, but I am now.
This is classic blue chicken cult action.
And so, but the weird thing is he had all these satanic connections. So it was just very strange and very weird.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is important to point out, which is the cult thing is important for us to acknowledge. It's a big issue in 2020. And the fact that the internet and the social media platforms and the Facebook groups, they can behind the scenes in these private groups whip up people and, you know, control them and harvest them. We've seen this before, the various task force that they use. These are the types of things that I think we need to be aware of. And I thought you did a great job actually doing that. And I knew by the fact that Good, who I've dealt with, as many people know for years, that the fact that you ran out in 2 minutes, you know, he usually lasts a little longer than that. So I knew he figured out pretty quick with you there was no way out.
Yeah, I guess well, actually, he was deleting tweets. I was trying to respond to them and he was deleting them. So he was cutting and running. And then, you know, but yeah, I don't know what to say. I wish that he had actually engaged, and I wish that, I mean, not for him, but for the sake of his followers, I wish that he would have engaged with me. I wish that I would like Corey and David and Roger to engage with you and I would like to talk. I would like to discuss what they're doing. And I'd like not weird threats and things like that, but actual conversation. And I challenge them to do that.
That's the only thing that they're good at is threats, because under an ordinary exchange, you know, their various stories fall apart. And that's the problem. And this is the problem with not just the Good cult and Wilcock and all this kind of thing, but also with the To the Stars Academy, which I found very interesting at the end of the year. they were going out and saying, oh, we've done all this stuff, and Elizondo this and Elizondo that. And John Greenwald over at the Black Vault had proven that Elizondo's story that they based this whole thing on was completely false, that he didn't run this ATIP program. So they didn't address that, and they talked more about how, it was a spiritual thing that they found this out, man. And, they've been talking more about this, Gigi, and it's interesting to me that they are now kind of moving into the consciousness zone after they've had kind of lukewarm success in relation to the UFO threat aspect. And TTSA, of course, is To the Stars Academy, and it's Tom DeLonge and his merry CIA controllers at this organization, which is a very unusual organization and has a lot of pull with the press. But I found this interesting, Gigi. They want to talk about origins, Genesis. They want to start to control that original narrative.
Always. That's always where it goes. It's not the authentic position, in my opinion, is actually giving people spiritual techniques, actually helping people remember who they are and regain abilities, because the memories that you have when you're waking up and the abilities that you create actually create the future. They actually create the energy that is the higher sphere that we're to move into. So these memories, the process of remembering, Steiner would say the cosmic memory, and your role in there is so important because it becomes a foundation of the new age. It becomes a foundation of our new society, and it makes you an autonomous being. So why do these people go in and tell you what disclosure is? Why would they want to do that? Why would they want to tell you what your human origins are? TTSA, why would you want to do that? Why do you want to talk about progenitors and human origins and hybridization and things like that? They have to take it to a spiritual level because that's where everything is going. But they want to do it so that they have control over consciousness and over that narrative. It's going to be
afraid, yes,
for them to do that.
Well, they're afraid if they let that horse out of the barn, that the instant thing that will happen when a large portion of society raises its spiritual level is they'll see through those guys. Right.
They'll get that clairvoyance back, and they'll be like, oh, we got to disconnect from this. But it is interesting. That's always been one thing, is they also mix spirituality and politics. And they mix it, they mix all these things together, which is like the perfect kind of mind control, society control, like formula, basically. So.
Absolutely. And we've seen them run these things, all the way back to MK Ultra and propaganda that they've laid out. And now they use a lot of EMK Ultra, and there's a lot of entrainment technology, and they found the entrainment technology through Candy Crush and things like that. So really we're surrounded by it in various fashions, and the human mind is very suggestible and malleable to a certain extent because we are on that journey of growth and understanding. So I think the more that we understand these aspects, the better off we're going to be. Everyone, we're watching, you're watching, and we're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young, and Gigi is at gigiyoung.com. She has a fascinating YouTube presence also. And Gigi, your series, which is In Plain Sight, which you spend a lot of time going deep on these, this is fascinating, and I've pointed out that it's very ahead of its time.
Yeah, I have a series called In Plain Sight on my channel, and it's all about exposing the dark occult roots in society.
Uh-oh.
I know. And
so you're banned from the New Age, is what you're saying?
I'm banned. Well, the New Age, in order to actually form a New Age, we need to address the shadow.
There you go.
You can't paint over a wall if there's peeling, cracked, mold, crap all over it. We need to remove the forces that are detrimental, or at least discuss it. It's not even, we need to have a better process of creating a kind of better discernment for the spirit, for spiritual, because it's so confusing right now. So In Plain Sight is all about kind of exposing what the dark occult is, which is really just a perversion of nature. It's a perversion of light. It's a perversion of lighter rituals that are sacred. Because the more you know, so that,
Yes.
if you can pick it out, you're not going to be subject to it. The more educated you are, the less susceptible you are.
It's fascinating, yeah, and you've really dived in deep on a number of darker topics, which I think is fascinating. And how many episodes are you up to now?
I think I have maybe like 15 or 20.
Fantastic.
Something like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, just a great library there of information, and people can actually join your course, your intuition course, at gigiyoung.com. Really recommend looking into that. Now, we're going to be taking questions in the second part of the show. It's a great crowd tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces out there for this New Year's show, and it's very special. You can feel there's a lot of momentum in the air for 2020, and I would love to talk to some numerologists out there about 2020, because we know that that's just something kind of spectacular in the numbers lineup. But we're going to be taking questions in the second part. You can ask them now. You ask them all in caps, and they're for GG or at least X series oriented. And Miss Olivia will be handling that. How are you doing out there?
I'm doing great. Do you want to field the question right now?
Absolutely.
Okay, everybody seems to love this question. From Aiden Daniel Bach. Hi, love the show. What's the Mystery School's position about God? Does he exist? Let's get right down to it.
Well, it's interesting, right? The Mystery School, there's so many. Gigi, why don't you take a crack at that?
Yeah. So, God is, the mystery schools, in my opinion, would be exploring how God works within us and externally, and understanding that. And so absolutely. And there's there's extremely refined ways to practice. And then there's very kind of open, more, I guess, less refined ways, or more kind of simple ways. But yeah, absolutely. It's all about God. It's all about how to relate. It's all about God in different ages, and how the cosmos expresses itself as God, how human. It's all about that. Absolutely.
It's fascinating when you think about it, because what comes to mind immediately for me is how persecuted the mystery schools have been over time. You can imagine if there's some secret occult group that grew large in France, exploiting the royalty, or in some cases joining with the royalty. And then you have another group, which also is an esoteric order and acts in secret and all the rest of it. But they have nothing to do with all those types of dark occult rituals. And then their truth, when they come out with it, they get persecuted. And actually, it can be the more negative occult groups in line with the power structures that are persecuting them. It's very interesting, as they don't like the competition very often.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would actually go as far to say, if you're actually considering the Godhead, if you're actually considering God, dark occult schools have nothing to do with that. They're not even really mystery schools. They're sort of weird spin-offs that have, created themselves. But they're not actually representing that force anymore. The higher dimensional force, they're not really, they're a distortion. They're not even really connected with it. So they're not
absolutely
a totally different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the secret societies that are what they call the left-hand side, that gets into the dark occult aspects. Those societies very often exploit the techniques of the actual mystery schools. And this is the mix-up, I think, that occurs so often when people think about that. And we need some, to be frank, we need frank discussion about that too, because every time, somebody sees a symbol or something like that, they're like, oh my God, they must be part of a secret evil cult. When in fact, I got that with someone on the Enneagram. And the Enneagram is something that Gurdjieff brought out from the Sarmoon Brotherhood. And that's that 9-pointed star structure. And someone sent me a big thing about the Enneagram and how it's, it's an upside down pentagram and all this stuff that made no sense. That was just kind of like fast food, cheap occultism. And, having known the background of the Enneagram, I was like, oh my God, this person is running around saying this stuff to other people who just don't know anything about it. But if you spend any time with the Enneagram, it's a totally different thing. It's actually to develop a system of types for spiritual evolution, basically. And it comes out of, largely it comes out of hidden Sufi traditions, which are all, those are high moral orders, basically. So it's very interesting to me, and I think that that's an important separation to make, which is spiritual work, as we see, just like when we get around intense sort of Bible-thumping Christianity, when it gets into the alien field, all the aliens are demons. So we have to be able, we need a broader stroke when we look at these things. We need a more open kind of canvas to look at these things on, to say, like, no, I mean, aliens, because they don't fit in, with the traditional Christian model from 2,000 years ago, it doesn't make them evil. It just means it's an opportunity to grow the viewpoint.
Exactly. And, all religion is just made to help us actually connect with spirit and be able to kind of discern our world, give us a structure. And so it's not doing that if it's labeling everything as bad or good, really, so.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, what we're going to do, here's what I want to do. Speaking of bad, Ahriman is an aspect of this show that I want to get into. And he is pretty bad, I guess you could say, traditionally. Ahriman is something that Rudolf Steiner pointed out as a dark astral force. And the term actually comes from Persian mythology. And I thought it was interesting that he used this in relation to what we're facing here. And he talked a lot about our kind of technological future being fueled by this connection with Ahriman. It's something he referred to as the eighth sphere. We're going to get into both of those now. Steiner, when he was talking to his students, he was relating how he had a series of visions relating to Ahriman. One of those visions was very unusual, that he had envisioned Ahriman in a cave, and that Ahriman in this cave was counting and making mathematical foundations and going deeper into mathematical foundations. And that it was this incredibly dry, dense, heavy atmosphere, getting heavier the more he tuned into it, and that he actually felt, Gigi, like he was sinking into concrete. And everything was getting heavy. So his students recommended that they wanted to see what he was looking at. And he spent the time meditating to get this Ahriman vision down and sculpted it himself. As we know, he's just an amazing kind of Renaissance guy. He had these skills of sculpting on top of everything else. This is the figure that he sculpted. And we'll take a quick look at this. A lot in expression, and I have to say Steiner captures something quite remarkable there. This force, the Ahrimanic force, I'm going to spell it, it's Ahriman. Ahriman is, in the Persian mythology, he is the opponent of Ahura Mazda. And in some traditions of that Persian mythology, he is also the twin of Ahura Mazda. And he's often portrayed as a kind of a fierce, chimerical beast. And Ahura Mazda is very often having to use two swords on him at once just to hold him at bay, not even to beat him. Some of this imagery, Gigi, coming out of Steiner's tuning in, he is giving us a kind of devil figure, but it's a little different. It's kind of the devil in the technology aspect.
Yes, and I think that, what Steiner channeled is what is more, like, we'll look back on that and be like, oh my gosh. Because when we think about, kind of like black magic or the dark occult, we kind of think of people in robes lighting candles and doing things like that. We don't really have a perspective on, what the dark occult would look like with technology. Like, how would technology affect the dark occult? Because I think we kind of have a 1800s idea of what the dark occult is, like just go out into the woods and, kill a cat or something, or a person. But the reality is that we have this extra component now in society that nothing in any darker texts really talked about at the time. So that element is technology. And so we have to consider, well, how would, the dark occult, and when I say dark occult, I mean individuals that are actually piercing the veil and going interdimensional with their consciousness and summoning lower beings. These beings are actually, in this context, part of the eighth sphere. So we have to start thinking about how technology would be part of that process. That's why Ahriman looks like the devil. I also feel like Ahriman kind of looks like a gray alien a little bit at times. So we have a challenge on our hands to recognize him and what his influence is in our life.
Well, it's fascinating when we come at it through spiritual science, through anthroposophy, Steiner's teaching. We are getting that Ahriman is the kind of sum total of the scientific materialism. He's the great influencer of this wave. The wave started in earnest in 1840, the intense move towards materialism, which caused a great shakeup among the mystery schools, some of them saying we need to let these secrets out because in a short period of time, these people will be so disconnected from their spiritual roots that they won't be recognizable as human beings in 100 years or so. And so, that tug of war that was taking place, on the surface, we were getting the push towards scientific materialism, the push away from spiritual ideas and just what you could measure. A particular type of scientific method, scientific materialism, which was actually a small division of scientific work. It wasn't even the dominant aspect. It was a very small portion of the thought there emanating largely from Germany at the time. So this split and a lot of the spiritual growth that we see happening around this period is in response to this incredible scientific materialism coming down. Now, a lot of the things that came out, like spiritualism, everything from seances to psychic ability to reincarnation, Gigi, these things were suddenly reacquired by the public consciousness on some level, even on a superficial level, and that was a change.
Yeah, it was, to almost like to balance out what was going to be coming. We got to give these people some techniques. We've got to give them some examples. We got to build that bridge, make that connection, because with scientific materialism, that part of that is, forgetting, is basically creating such tight parameters around what is real that you completely eliminate things in other dimensions pretty much. And so they were trying to give, the mystery schools were trying to give people techniques and inspiration so that they could, like a life preserver almost, so they could survive this, deep phase of only focus on materialism that we're in now.
Right. We're really the product of what happened there in many ways, because there is a balance now where there's some knowledge of the spiritual stuff. It has accelerated, but at the same time, the incredible takeover around the technological aspect. And again, I'm someone who spent a decade as a tech editor. I have always enjoyed the technology. I know you use the technology quite a bit. We're not suggesting that somehow the technology is evil or that we should go back to become Luddites and not use the technology. It is more about the ethical use on a mass scale of this technology in the wrong hands, which goes directly back to your original quote from Steiner. So, Gigi, apprehending these things and this kind of AI, we're going to get into the AI aspect of the eighth sphere here shortly. And I'm going to read some quotes that I think are going to be genuinely, they sent shivers through me, which is not easy. Some of the things that the artificial intelligence scientists are planning, what they have in the pipeline, is extraordinary for this decade. And I think that we're looking at a situation that has to be balanced out soon. That is this larger expansion of people's awareness about this. We hear so much regurgitation of themes like Great Awakening and things like that in relation to politics over and over again. However, these same people aren't objecting to the fact that we spend almost $1 trillion every year with the National Defense Authorization Act, that we're building up our nuclear weapons force, which, by the way, had been negotiated down in 1987 by Reagan and Gorbachev. We didn't need to expand or make these things or set off a new arms race. And now Russia has hypersonic weapons. I mean, this is problematic, because you can think, and I want to address this, in that 2 minutes hate in the 1984 stuff, this is very Ahrimanic, because what they would do is they would put people out and they would get really high on hating their enemy, the enemy of the party. And so they would have all these people come out to this huge screen for 2 minutes and get all their hatred out. And that kept their brainwashing condition intact, because once they got that hate out, they could go back to whatever they were doing. So it kept them locked in that state that they knew there was something to hate. And I think that, in a sense, the 2 minutes hate that we're getting so much, I'd like to say that was just the mainstream media, but we get it a lot in the independent media as well. That prevents us from seeing this larger picture of things like, well, as part of like a real Great Awakening would include the fact that, the rush towards artificial intelligence and things like the large scale development of military weapons and putting weapons in space and things like that, as Trump has proposed to do with the Space Force, is not good policy. And like, this is the interesting thing that I see going on, where we have these divisions, but, in that idea that we're getting more politically aware, or there's an awakening going on, people are completely missing. And this aspect, I think, those people that are talking about it, which is that we're in a weird situation in relation to this, because we're celebrating trillions of dollars in armaments. So, Gigi, it's an interesting thing, because what are you awakening to exactly? Awakening is a very specific kind of a thing. You can think you're awake, but actually you are kind of waking up in a nightmare.
Absolutely. And there is a battle for consciousness, and it's a very big deal. And that's why, as time passes, we see nothing really getting done. And actually having armaments in space, as you mentioned, is breaking a treaty. It's not like they're just doing it like, ooh, we're going to do this. It's like, no, you're breaking something. That's right. Aggressive.
Yes.
That's aggression. So, this is actually pretty aggressive. Like it's an attack, I think, on the public, and it's an insult to the public. But I think at the top of it all, we'll find that there is an agenda, and that's why we see these things being rolled out and all these things happening at certain times, like you mentioned, with vaccines or with arming space and siphoning all this money to the point where it's trillions. I mean, there's so much covert stuff going on, but it's not just covert. I think it's leading somewhere, and this is where we get into Ahriman and really the mass possession of society. That level of reality, I think, this is my perspective, and obviously I'm a mystic, I'm a spiritual person, but I think that that's the level that it needs to be addressed. I don't think we'll actually understand what's going on until we can address it from more of a mystery approach, more of like a spiritual approach, not in like a Hallmark card, but a genuine spiritual, as Steiner would say, spiritually scientific approach, because we have the solutions. We have them. And we have great people who would be leaders and who can put these things in place. But we're not looking at that, and that's a problem.
Absolutely. And when I think about some of the great people on the independent media side, I think of people like Catherine Austin Fitts or Dr. Joseph Farrell, Professor Scott. I mean, we have incredible brain trust right now. There is the ability to move on these things. And
right.
In that sense, it's our own responsibility.
Because it's one thing if like we have these problems, but nobody's trained, nobody has the knowledge, nobody has the skill. That's one thing, but that's not our problem. That's not the problem that we're facing. We're facing actually kind of like a weirder problem, whereas everybody here, we have great people, but we're not utilizing, we're not listening, and we're not giving them, giving them the attention or whatever it is to put them in the proper position, to make good changes, because the leadership is here. We're just not doing it right. So
right. Well, it's very interesting, the tie-in to on the mystery school side, because it seems like when we look back, we see movements like the Theosophical Society, Anthroposophy, Gurdjieff's Fourth Way movement, Edgar Casey's work, which is incredible, 4 decades long, transformational work that has to do with psychic activity, world affairs, health, so many different angles. It's actually building a new world, as many of these movements were. That, Gigi, was a setup for what they knew we were going to face coming into the century.
Right. They knew the problems that we were going to face, maybe not exactly how they were going to manifest precisely, but they knew the energies that were coming, and they knew certain patterns and archetypes that were going to emerge. There are actually great teachings within everything that you mentioned, within within Gurdjieff and Casey and Steiner, to deal with this. We just have to start putting them in place and putting our energy there. But I think the thing is that there isn't that sense of like drama with it. And in order to what we're facing is an opportunity to have a better society. Actually, that's really what's ahead of us, is actually a better way of living. That's what we're facing, but that takes everybody having the bravery and the courage to go inside first, because we are our leaders. We like to just say, oh, this person arrived here and they're crappy and whatever, but it's like, well, that you have to have some kind of responsibility and accountability. And then a lot of the mystery teachings open up and you're like, how is this even here? Like these great, society, the earth has had great societies before. The earth has had golden ages before. So, there is memory, and there is these things have been recorded. It's not something that we're figuring out. We're just figuring out how to do it in this time with this particular situation. But
right, it's fascinating. It's a great point, which is when we're looking at Greek civilization, we're looking at Egyptian civilization. These are civilizations fueled by the mystery traditions. And, in some cases, those mystery schools like Essenes, they stand up under great scrutiny, suffering under Rome. And so it's not just that you're going to roll into your spiritual role and everything's going to be hunky-dory. You might have to face a fairly hostile situation in terms of where the world goes and hold your truth anyway.
Absolutely. And I have to ask Olivia, do you have something to add? I feel like you might have something here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have not been following your conversation.
She's deep in.
There are such great questions. I mean, we could just stop all the research you've done and go straight to questions, and we have another hour and a half to go.
Olivia said such great things about society and stuff in our little conversations, but.
Oh, she's going to be adding more as we go, for
I have
sure.
a lot to add.
Yes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here with Gigi Young, X Series episode 76. This is Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere, Rudolf Steiner, and this is the battle for the Eighth Sphere, which is what we're going to get into. But it's interesting coming into the beginning of 2020 as we are, all these things are coming up that we're talking about, and you have to start to wonder how to position that mystery teaching in the midst of all this chaos, where they want to, sort of strip away even gender identification, Gigi. Gender X is what they've got the proposition for in New York now. And this is a very interesting thing because for me, and I've spoken with Dr. Farrell about this, we see very, very hermetic esoteric traditions being twisted coming into some of these policies, which is very unusual. For example, the tree of life in the Hermetic sense, and some of these scientists that we're going to quote here shortly, they understand the Hermetic tradition of the tree of life very well. And in that tradition, what you do is through spiritual growth, you go up through the various portions, and you go from animal into mineral, and then you go further up, and by the end, you're there at the Godhead, and you're kind of plugged into everything. But what they're trying to do on the technological side with scientists like Kurzweil and, the types of things that they're trying to do with merging with machines is on an occult level, they are trying to merge and jump to that mineral level and get around the whole getting up to the spiritual Godhead and just move there through the technology. I'm going to project my consciousness into this, cube, and I'm going to be able to get there to that Godhead without doing any of the spiritual work. Gigi, doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. Evolution, for it to authentically be evolution, is organic.
Right.
It is to evolve. It's
right.
Organic. And organic evolution is not adding, machine parts to you or putting yourself in a machine. That's you playing God. Let's get it straight. That's you playing God. That's not organic. That's you misinterpreting things because your ego is so big that it's all about you. You haven't done the purification work, and you haven't done the proper steps to even consider the material that you've probably seen or been initiated into. It's wacky, it's dangerous. And it's a lot of people don't even realize that this is a ritual. They don't realize that actually, like, the creation of AI is being ritualistically done. Like you said, they're using the tree of life. People don't realize that it's even a ritual, right?
Right.
Which makes things even more scary. When people start taking things to the spiritual level, that's getting deep.
Yeah.
That's getting deep, and it's like, we need to have a talk level. We need to, that's not
time for public discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to have dialogues where everything has gone over with a fine-tooth comb.
Oh, Gigi, you extremist. Are you kidding me?
I know. How dare I? I'm going to be sued, and I'm in jeopardy.
What hate speech. I can't even believe it. We're going to jump to the eighth sphere. So brace yourself here.
Okay.
First, want to show everyone. Yes, exactly. You're going to have to teach me that later. This is an image of the angel Uriel. And there's a reason that I'm pointing this out. And of course, interestingly enough, as you can see on the very top of their head is this pyramid with an eye open. We know that's been identified pretty heavy duty with Illuminati symbols, and we've seen it on the back of the US dollar and all the rest of it. But there's a couple of other references around this period, like images like this, for example. Let's see how this shows up. This is the sun coming in and being harnessed by these kind of lamps, and these little angels assisting with this. All these images relating to this eighth sphere idea, and I'm going to show you how in a moment. I'm going to read from something where the eighth sphere originally came up through someone named Alfred Percy Sennett, better known as A.P. Sennett. And a lot of people have talked about why Steiner, as the head of anthroposophy, vehemently, 20 years after he had put out this information about the eighth sphere, tried to correct him. And I went back and really tried to figure out Sennett quite a bit. And what I realized is that his book, which was a theosophical classic in the period called Esoteric Buddhism, that was the first mention of the eighth sphere anywhere. That's from 1883. Now, this is such a large-scale mystery school secret about the eighth sphere. And he mentions it out of context and actually misidentifies it with the moon, which is why Steiner goes on the record with it. But I was still looking at it and being like, why does he feel the need? And when I went back and I realized that Sennett's book was, aside from Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, was the most popular theosophical book, and it had 8 printings. So 8 editions over the course of 5 years. That's an incredibly popular book. So, I guess you could call it, it had that, what was the not the Christian Science book, the Scientology book that they had so big and huge and popular. Dianetics, exactly. So it was like the Dianetics of its time. And the reason that he had to go back in there was because the Synod doctrine had kind of dominated everything that came out of Theosophy, to the point where Synod's work was actually, in some levels, even more respected than Blavatsky's, which is remarkable to think about. This is Alfred Percy Synod, who was quite a good writer and definitely was somebody who was a seeker, although, according to Steiner, he was being duped. We're going to get into that. But it is in his classic work, Esoteric Buddhism, that the 8th sphere gets mentioned. And what's fascinating is he engages, after meeting with Blavatsky's masters through a series of letters back and forth. And in these letters, this master in Theosophy called Kuthumi from a mystery school is sending him correspondence, actual letters. Those letters still exist today, and very oddly, they still can't figure out the kind of ink and the way that ink hasn't decayed. The letters are very unusual and still have kind of magical properties, shall we say. So I'm going to read from the original Esoteric Buddhism, so we get into this idea of what the 8th sphere is. This is A.P. Synod. Quote, "We have followed the higher principles of persons recently dead, observing the separation of the astral dross from the spiritually durable portion. That spiritually durable portion being either holy or satanic in its nature, and provided for in Devachan or Avicii accordingly." Devachan and Kamaloka are these states that are referred to in Tibetan Buddhism and also in Theosophy. "We have examined the nature of the elementary shell cast off, and preserving for a time a deceptive resemblance to a true entity. Now, we have paid attention also to exceptional cases of 4 principled beings in Kamaloka, who are the victims of accident or, in many cases, sudden death. But what happens to a personality which has absolutely no atom of spirituality, no trace of spiritual affinity, either good or bad? Clearly, in such a case, there is nothing for the 6th principle to attract to itself, or in other words, such a personality has already lost its principle. But Kamaloka is no more a sphere of existence for such a personality than the subjective world. Kamaloka may be permanently inhabited by astral beings, by elementals, but who can only be an antechamber for some other state of human beings. In the case imagined, the surviving personality is promptly drawn into the 8th sphere. Gigi, that's the first mention of what the 8th sphere is. Now, interestingly enough, in that same book, later, Synod says that Kuthumi sends him another letter. This is a later edition of the book. And he feels the Mahatma finally comes to regret that they brought up the subject of the 8th sphere at all in these letter exchanges with him. Kuthumi writes impatiently, "Be careful as to what you say upon forbidden topics. The 8th sphere mystery is a very confidential subject, and you are far from understanding even its general aspect. You were repeatedly warned and should not have mentioned it. You have unintentionally brought ridicule upon a solemn matter," unquote. So the 8th sphere, as it comes up here, as the way Synod brings it out, he feels that he's sort of tracing the evolutionary path of the soul as part of its reincarnation. And he figures, for the souls that don't develop, that they are being cast into the moon, basically. So it's a very kind of primitive idea of this 8th sphere. Later, Steiner will bring it out and he will say, the 8th sphere, the way he describes it, it almost sounds like a virtual reality, that the 8th sphere permeates the earth and that it is a kind of a fantasy realm that is controlled by Ahriman, and that when we project our thoughts in a fashion that is not in line with a spiritual reality, we start to go into the eighth sphere. And it's like a lifelong process. It's not just boom, we end up in the eighth sphere. He has a diagram that I want to bring out here of how the space that it occupies. Let's take a quick look at this. This are the various stages in anthroposophy of human, the evolutionary pattern of humanity. Here, down here, is the eighth sphere, and it's connected, as you can see here, with the Earth. Now, what's fascinating about the rest of these is that that normal evolutionary track is there, but once you get to the Earth, you've got this thing, this overhang of the eighth sphere. So the eighth sphere is intimately interwoven with the Earth, and it is in fact sort of harvesting the Earth. And this is the nature of the kind of anthroposophical cosmology around this. When we look at it, we've got Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan. This is the anthroposophical sweep. And Vulcan is one of those spheres which is not developed into a planet yet. So this is how kind of obscure he's speaking about it. There's no Uranus, there's no Neptune on here, even though they were already discovered. So they're intentionally left out, which should be kind of interesting from a different point of view. But Gigi, this linking in of Earth and the eighth sphere is as if the joint evolution of the two, they somehow are both evolving at the same time, and one is kind of feeding off the other.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting because a lot of the times we talk about like ascension, we don't really talk about descension, which is sort of a devolution. And a lot of the New Age is all about ascension, 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 but there's also this process of descension as well, which is, as the gentleman described of Ahriman in the cave, you know, descending deeper and deeper and deeper into matter, such as adding, you know, AI components and things like that. How's my audio? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay.
So far, so good.
Getting a little weird for me. I'm glad it's okay.
Is it coming back to you a little bit?
Yeah, it's fine though, as long as I'll just turn it down a little bit.
Okay.
Anyway, so basically we have to kind of, with the understanding of ascension and moving into the higher spheres, as you mentioned, things like Jupiter, Vulcan, Venus, there's also a descension process where if the individual cannot release the pain and the trauma and acknowledge through what you were mentioning about serenity and faith and things like that, if the individual cannot integrate that, and this is not forced upon us as people, this is through our own process, through our own free will, if we cannot integrate that, then we become heavier and heavier, and we start to kind of resonate more with this eighth sphere. So that's how I kind of psychically see it. And the eighth sphere has it's almost like there's two vacuums. And as individuals, we're kind of either aligning with one vacuum or another vacuum, or one magnetic process or another magnetic process. We're kind of being pulled. And we're either being pulled into the higher world, which is what we understand as, you know, ascension and things like that. But there's also a pull into a lower, more dense world too. And that's through, you know, our actions and through, you know, how we choose to live.
Oh, it's a great point. It's a day-to-day experience. It could be a very harmonic experience to get overly into and glorify a football team or football stars. I mean, that's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, you know, there's certainly far more dangerous versions of it, but I often see this quality of people going into these harmonic states. That's the eighth sphere idea. It is a kind of virtual reality where you're projecting your consciousness out and you are entering a kind of a false reality, you know, and we've seen it when people get is overly into celebrities' lives to a point where they start to identify with the celebrity. Mm-hmm. This is a really deep problem too, because I remember there's a guy in, if you study the Casey readings, there's a guy who comes to him and his whole life he's had visions of Williams Jennings Bryan. and this major political figure. And he's like, was I Bryant? Because I have all these memories about him. And he said, no, you were someone who was obsessed with Bryant,
Right.
Well, that's a hard one to take.
Right. So we think about this, but we do have that where once you're projected in, you can lose your own sense of identity. That, for me, gets at the harmonic aspect of the eighth sphere. And we see a lot of that in, what's kind of seducing you about a modern culture, which is it's trying to strip away your own kind of moral boundaries. It's trying to strip away any sense of ethics that people have. There's a lot of that seems to me to have that essence of trapping. And again, this idea of the mystery schools, and particularly Steiner talking about the eighth sphere as a trap that you kind of voluntarily walk into.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it comes through, I think, not understanding your process as a human being. And so it's like, if you see someone that you really, really admire, figure out what that quality is and integrate it in your life. So they were trying to do something, but they got lost in the process, right? Rather than aligning with reality, they tried to kind of create their own reality. So that level is, that level of, and anything, I would say too, like maybe this would work, like anything that would project you outside of your body without purpose, without correct purpose. So like if you're doing a ton of drugs or substances, and you're kind of, you're almost like projecting yourself into a state, you're not anchored. Or projecting yourself, fantasizing that you're another person. Anytime you're not really honoring your identity and your divinity and who you are and living that out, and then you're almost creating a false self, and that becomes real, more and more real. And that's like an eighth sphere anchoring, and that's what it's made out of,
Right. You've made an artificial shell, a projection of what you really are. And it's interesting because I think of this kind of wax dummy world of the eighth sphere. This is the kind of impression that I get with it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young. This is X Series episode 76. We're going deep on Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy and spiritual science versus Ahriman in the eighth sphere. And this is a major kind of thing when we're looking at the 2020 and the era that we're in. We can see these forces kind of getting into position, and it is this knowledge. It's so fascinating, Gigi, to see Waldorf schools targeted because large amounts of the parents don't like their children's getting excessive vaccines, which is something that Steiner had warned about all the way back in 1921.
Yeah, well, Waldorf schools are a big threat because the more that parents lose control of their child, the more parents are going to look up alternatives. And if these, the government and these people, they want to make more vaccines, and they want to make vaccines mandatory, and then they want to make other things mandatory, they're going to have to eliminate any other schooling programs that are honoring the freedom of the parent and the child. They have to humiliate those programs. They have to get rid of them because they're just going to fill up. Whether people know probably who Steiner is or not, they're going to say, I don't want vaccinations, so here we go.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating when you think about it, because one of the issues that I think they have is the Waldorf schools, the people who send their kids to Waldorf schools have place in society, have money. And it might be easy to bulldoze people in the inner cities to be like, hey, line up for your flu shot, or you need these 78 vaccines in order to get into public schools. Unfortunately, they've made it like that. But the Waldorf people are going to be like, what do you think you're doing? And it's very interesting to me that they're being targeted so heavily in England and in America. And the New York Times just did a major hit piece on them in relation to this. Yes.
All right. So now may be a good time for me to chime in and say why I have been suspended from Twitter.
That's right.
Okay.
This happened, by the way, on New Year's.
Yeah.
And
this happened this morning.
Yeah.
I woke up, checked my Twitter, and found out I had been suspended. I had never received a warning before, never, ever got suspended, nothing. So they deleted my tweet and then suspended my account. I don't know for how long. So we shall see. So Oprah was on the Ellen show, Oh, by the way, I used to love Oprah and quote her all the time, just so you know. I respected her tremendously and her contribution to consciousness and all that. So she gave this story about having pneumonia. And basically she is, oh God, do I say it, a big pharma shill right now, who's going on, a 9-city speaking tour, health and wellness tour, is what she's calling it, where she is promoting vaccinations for flu and pneumonia.
Right, and again, we're not talking about, let's get this in context. 6 vaccinations is what they used to require in 1990. Okay, now what they require is 76. This is why RFK Jr. is exposing this. And also, one quick thing about this to make the point. When we look at the stats around it and the fact that there's so much vaccine injury, that the government has had to pay out these things. In 1986, they created a law that the vaccine companies could not be sued because they were getting sued so much that they were just said, oh, we're not even going to do it. So the government decided to protect them so they would continue in this process because they didn't want to have to do it themselves. So they can't be sued, 1. 2, they also use the CDC emergency powers for getting these things through. And that's like using continuity of government emergency action. That's why they don't need traditional safety tests. So when we keep all that in mind, now keep going.
Okay, sorry, I was really listening to you. I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, what it is basically, so she's going out on a tour. Now, this is somebody, Oprah, who's very
plugged I know exactly what I was going to say. Okay, so for those of you who do not know, spermicide has been found in the flu vaccine.
Right.
Okay, so we know that there's I'm just putting it out there, there's a globalist agenda for depopulation and for pregnancy control, reproduction, and all of that. And I cannot help, I think it's so cynical what is happening with Oprah. And obviously she has globalist handlers. And that's so upsetting.
So what did you tweet, Olivia?
I don't want to say specifically because I don't want your channel to get targeted.
Right.
But it was not that bad. It certainly didn't threaten her. It wasn't hate speech. But, what I find, one, I think they're targeting minority communities with this because she's a huge icon to the minority communities, and also just soccer moms who idolize her. And those soccer moms are the ones who make the vaccination decisions for their families. So this is
so she was letting down.
She is going out there. I fully know. I think she's a very brilliant woman. She knows exactly what she's doing, and I wish she wouldn't do it because it's a huge betrayal. So
fascinating.
Rant over.
Now, this is the interesting thing. So you did that. They suspended you on Twitter. Now, oddly enough, when you went to go in there and they said, oh, yeah, you can check your messages while you're doing it, they revamped your account and actually came up with a different name for your account.
Yeah, so it's somehow hacked.
So that's a whole other thing. But I found that very interesting. It was like a double whammy on top of it. But Gigi, this is how it's going to work. Now, we talk about this all the time on this program. If we talk about a certain issue, we run the risk of getting thrown off the platform. I always remind people, like I'm going to remind them right now, sign up for the newsletter, go to darkjournalist.com and make sure that we have that direct pipeline. If you're following Gigi Young, go to gigiyoung.com. Don't rely on just YouTube or whatever. Make sure you're on the newsletter list. So it's that kind of connection. But Gigi, the censorship, out of control, OOC in 2020.
It's going to be out of control. 2020 is going to be a really, really interesting year for us. It's funny about the Oprah thing because you and I had been discussing, actually, Oprah.
Yes.
You and I had made it like a prediction that this would occur. Yes. And with Oprah, I actually think that this is just the beginning with her. I believe that she's going to go on a spiritual tour as well. This health tour is the beginning. But she's actually going to go on tour and she's going to talk about spirituality and she's going to try to, there's a reason why she did Super Soul Sunday and all these, things like that. And everything is that she's actually going to be gathering all of her connections in the spiritual community and she is going to basically spiritually inoculate people just like she is physically inoculating people or pushing the physical inoculation. And I see her going on tour and trying to gather up all these big authors and names that are not, they may be spiritual, but they're not aware of they're not initiated into certain topics and certain things in a practical way, And so, but I do feel like she's going to go on tour and it's going to be to harness spiritual people people that are disenfranchised from religion, people that like the New Age, people that are distraught from all the corruption, all the fighting on Twitter, all those people that are down Oprah, bang, get excited about your life, motivational, spiritual stuff. And I think that's what's going to happen. So we have to be careful with that, because her revealing herself as being someone that is, pushing this is, she's something else interesting is also happening in 2020, where we're going to see people doing things that don't really seem like it's part of their nature. Mm-hmm. Or people being connected, like interconnected, that you wouldn't think are connected at all. They're going to start coming together and doing things, going on speaking tours. You're going to start seeing them together. And this is very, very important for us to start noticing, because what's happening is that things are collapsing. There's battles going on for power, and things are consolidating. And so when you see these people like a musician and a pharmacist or an AI person coming together or whatever it is, you're seeing that, oh, well, these people are actually have a handler above them. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing expressions of their level of control. I hope this is making sense, but you're going to see these.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating too. And I think about the whole triptych there with Oprah and Dr. Phil, and, that she could bring in these authors and really promote them, and really, and in some cases, those authors that would come on were very good. So she has this, that kind of influence, as we know. What's fascinating is, though, now she's sort of like a billionaire who is trapped in that system and has to defend it. So she and Gates and Zuckerberg and, they all have to get together at Davos and plan out the next move before these guys lose control, because there's so much information out there. It's a very critical point, actually.
It's a very critical point. And we're going to be seeing, like, you don't think that like Oprah and Bill Gates and, the guy from Maroon 5 and, a contractor are all sitting in one room, but we're going to see that they are. And I think, it's very important for us to pay attention to these associations that we see.
Gigi, I want to ask you a question, because this being an empath, I try to understand people by putting myself in their shoes, just automatically. And when it really upsets me and distresses me when I can't understand how people justify things. Do you feel like people like Oprah, for example, have a conscience still? Because I do. And I don't understand how people who once had a conscience, who still have a conscience, although I have an answer in mind, but I'm wondering what you're going to say to this. How do they rationalize this stuff? I think Oprah's been to Bilderberg, hasn't she?
Yes. And what's interesting about this is Fitz, in a recent conversation that we had, I think last June, put the point out there that in those California fires, Oprah's house got burned down, and she was like, that was the message there, like, you're going to play along. Mm-hmm. But Gigi, that's a good point. Okay, let's give them all the benefit of the doubt that they do have a conscience and that they do understand these things. What would compel someone in Oprah's position to get behind something obviously as lethal as, say, 76 vaccinations?
I mean, I think that she has a choice. The reality is she has a choice. She can continue to do this, and she can use all of the power and attention that she has gathered on the backs of the public, may I add. She is where she is because people supported her, and she can understand that dynamic, and she can serve, and
right.
She can choose to serve, or she can choose to serve herself. And this is Oprah's choice, and anybody else's choice that is engaged in this. This is your choice. And we're going to be seeing who is making these choices. But, I would say someone like that's involved and chooses to be involved in these things, every time you do that, you chop off a limb of yourself. Every time that you choose to throw away somebody else's sovereignty just so you can feel better and not lose what? Lose money? Lose what? Like what? Your home? Anytime you make those wrong decisions, you cut off a limb of your own spirit. And so that's what she will do or not do. But I think that it just comes down to these moments in everybody's life where you face your own shadow. It's easy when everything's going well, when you have a hit show, when you have millions of dollars, to look great. But it's these moments in people's lives where the material world is being taken away from them that we see who we really are. It's very easy to act charismatic. For some people just have a way, it's probably earned from a past life, of just being charismatic and making you like them or whatever it is. And so you have to use that power for good, you know.
No question. Wow.
I just want to say,
yes.
Nance Hardwick just said, I had no idea. Oprah and Bill Gates own lots of land together in Louisiana and are, quote, farming crops. No someone who works there. That is deeply
great.
Disturbing to me.
Yeah. Oh, well, there we go. The power food dynamic. That's a big, deep dive. But I like what you were saying, Gigi, which is a choice on whatever level, whether you are, deep in that class or whether you are operating on a bootstrap level with your own startup or whatever. Everything is about the choice. And that's what we go back to again and again. It's funny, one of the principles I've observed that a lot of these corporations use, which is in fact a very esoteric principle, is about service. And, everything is about, in those mystery schools, you're graduating yourself to be of service. As a matter of fact, they talk about these two different states, and it's attunement and service. And if you attune without the service, you kind of implode, in a sense. And we do see a lot of that sweeping throughout different types of spiritual teachings, which is, I'm going to teach you this great way to kind of, lock into your most successful self, and you're going to be making 6 figures overnight and all this kind of thing. And then, you're on your way to being a spiritual millionaire. Gigi, it's great to have great abundance and wealth, but those two things, kind of aiming yourself in a spiritual direction, and using this kind of almost Wall Street language, they don't make good bedfellows somehow.
No, it's lies. And only in this time of scientific materialism can somebody become completely wealthy like that.
Right.
And lord it over, the public and do these things. Like, this is a product of the time that we're in, is we are so blind that we actually can't see people's energy bodies. We can't sense that they're connected or possessed. And so they're able to gain huge amounts of wealth and huge amounts of status and popularity because we're in this materialist age. And it's a really tough initiation for us in the public to face. But I mean,
it is.
I mean, if there's one thing, and I think people sometimes get it a little too mixed up with money, but if someone who is a spiritual person, their number one priority should not be the material world. The material world is by default in many ways taken care of because their focus is so much on the higher worlds. It's really hard to explain, but when somebody starts to become very, very obsessed with money and earning, and you get that sense from them, that immediately negates them because their focus isn't correct. So
absolutely. I remember I had an experience with a chiropractor years ago. And I had caught him at the beginning. He was a good chiropractor, and I always thought the guy was good. And I had stayed away from it for a couple of years, and I went back to him, and he had been kind of methodized. They had told him, hey, look, when you are serving one person, you could be serving 4. And I went in there, and the guy gave me a chiropractic adjustment while he was running around to these different rooms servicing these other people and making lots of money because he was serving 5 people where he was serving 1 before. And the guy came in, he did not even look at me. He did the adjustment and he said, prognosis excellent. And he ran out of the room. And I was like, there's your spiritual materialism right there.
Oh my gosh.
This guy.
I see it too in the New Age field where a lot of people are finding their spirituality, and it's like all of these courses and things like that, but they're marketed. Most of it is just really, 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 really heavy marketing, and very aggressive, and And like, you know, in the mystery tradition, obviously people didn't even start teaching until they were 40 usually. And so because
life coaches at 22.
yeah, like this is the thing. It's like it's not that you don't have something to offer. It's not that you shouldn't be in the field that you're in. It's just, I think the priority, it's so hypnotizing to just overmarket yourself and just focus on the material world, and there's no focus on the actual spiritual development. For, you know, when you're actually holding space with someone, you know, what are you offering? Like this guy wasn't offering, he wasn't with you, you know, when you're getting your adjustment, and that's not a service. That's like just the material mechanical adjustment. There is no service.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've had these incredible people do just the opposite, right? They'll spend like 2 hours with you and completely throw themselves down financially when they could be running from room to room. But this was so ridiculous, seeing this guy take on this profession. You know, he'd obviously studied it for years. He was excellent at it. And then it was a great demeaning of his ability, having to run around. But he literally had been, you know, zoomed up by a marketing expert.
Yeah.
And everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young. This is X-Series episode, X-Steganography Series episode 76. And the steganography, I wanted to bring this up because we had such deep steganography, X-Steganography come out in 2019 to the point where I was amazed at the level of it because, you know, in bringing forward those symbols for X-Steganography, it's a study. It's something that we could put kind of meat on the bones of a theory. And we had done a number of episodes in 2018 on the X series about X-Steganography and how it related to these secret programs going through the government, but also to these ancient mystery schools and even Masonic traditions using this symbol. But Gigi, in 2019, the X-Steganography was strutting down the runway. I mean, this stuff was everywhere. I have a few examples, and then I'm going to draw this back to Steiner because of the X-Steganography that he's using. And I do find it kind of fascinating, but while I'm locating that, Miss Olivia, why don't you let us know how it's going out there?
And it's going great. There are a lot of questions about the 8th sphere.
Good. That's what we're going to go into next. And this all actually ties in because, alas, Gigi, it's your discovery, the CERN X-17 particle. And the headline reads, "The plot thickens for a hypothetical X-17." Let's take a look at this thing. I'm going to stretch this out. Hold on, everyone. There we go. Let's try this. All right, that is the plot thickens for a hypothetical X-17 particle. This is something that they are pushing heavily at CERN on the X front. Additional evidence of an unknown particle from a Hungarian lab gives new impetus for particle searches. And they're saying we found this new fifth force in nature, Gigi, that gives the NA64 collaboration at CERN a new incentive to continue its searches. We're going to come back to this in a second, but watch this. This was Madonna X. And we saw a lot of music types, especially the really kind of heavily established types, pushing this X imagery, which was just interesting when you think about the X-Steganography aspects that we're talking about. Of course, people like Bezos was rolling out his version of the X-Steganography with his various space programs, and whenever he was around, they were showing that X-Steganography. And over and over again, we use so many examples. It's amazing to me that in 2019, that was really out there and bold. In 2018, when we were doing the first stretch of X episodes, it was definitely something which, you know, there was a history of, but it wasn't happening so much in that year. Gigi, by the time we get to 2019, boom, there we are.
It's, I mean, you predicted it. It's incredible. I mean, they're obviously rolling out certain people, certain ideas. I mean, it's entertainment, it's technology, you know, it's corporate, and they're doing a ritual. They're doing a ritual right in front of our eyes. They're telling us something, and they have to. They have to, right? They have to do that.
Yes.
And the CERN particle is interesting because they're just basically saying, "Oh, we discovered ether." You know,
Right.
They've discovered something that everybody knew about before, and then materialism dissolved it away, so no one talked about it for a while. Then they're like, "Oh, we discovered it, so guess what? Everything we tell you about it is the truth."
Right.
That's an eight-sphere maneuver. You're creating a fantasy, So
Yes. Yeah, it's their way of inserting. It's interesting too, because that's all wrapped up with Theosophy, which did a lot of scientific study.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that CERN feels the need to reacquire ether and give it this different name. And the particle name X17, very unusual. There are a series of unusual things about CERN's Alice facility, for example, and them calling it Dreamland. And the fact that they shut CERN down for a year, but they're reopening it now with a $22 billion budget, all the way up from $6 billion. They have big plans, Gigi. It's going to be 5 times the size of the original, which we've already cited the kind of scientific case for the damage that that thing does to the magnetosphere and the environment. This is a very unusual project in our modern world here, coming into 2020.
It's unusual on so many levels. It's unusual on the fact that it's been able to get the funding that it does, that it has been able to kind of legally establish itself as an island. It's like you can't do any examinations on it. You can't look into it. You can't sue it. It's the same technique that they did with vaccines. It's like you can't do anything. They're rendering people,
ineffective.
Yeah, and they're protecting themselves. And then on top of it, they use extremely occult and ritualistic names. They have, I think, LF. They have extremely ritualistic names for their reactors and for what they're doing. And then a lot of the people who are also associated with CERN are really dubious as well. And with transhumans, the whole thing is just, it's crazy, but I think that the public is just having such a hard time getting their head around it.
And this is fascinating too, because we've been talking about the 8th sphere. CERN, in a sense, you can look at it a few different ways, but in a sense, it feels like a direct pipeline into that 8th sphere. And they, after originally saying, well, we're not trying to do anything in other dimensions, now they're like, okay, well, we are trying to contact other dimensions. Contact. They left something out there on the public side of this. How are we supposed to know exactly, what it is they're trying to do? What's the technology that they're using? That thing was supposed to be to find the God particle, the Higgs boson, and supposedly they did. And the idea was they were going to recreate with basically, by smashing these particles together, they were going to recreate the Big Bang in the Large Hadron Collider there in Switzerland. And so what we have is a situation where they've done these experiments. CERN is also the largest user of the internet. And, they've done these experiments, and we've been seeing them for years get these gigantic military-style budgets. And now these other countries want their own particle colliders. It's a much deeper story.
Absolutely. It's a summoning. From a psychic place, it's a summoning device. I think they're communicating with what they think is a god. That's they're religiously protecting it, and I believe that they've been given guidance on how to build CERN over hundreds of years, and they've been seduced, and so. Yeah, it's something that we need to really wake up on and start asking questions and putting pressure on, so that we can start chipping away at some of the things that are going on there.
No question about it. And it's so kind of appropriate for this episode to touch on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going deep here with Gigi Young. And as we said earlier, with all of the incredible hassle that Olivia had on Twitter, you can see that the social media platforms are highly unstable. So make sure, sign up for the newsletter. That keeps us with a direct pipeline. Go right to darkjournalist.com. That's a free newsletter. And basically, you'll get an update about once a week about the shows that we have coming up for you and the incredible guests. I can't even tell you the incredible guest lineup we have for January and February, including Gigi Young, who's doing outstanding work at gigiyoung.com. Gigi, I wanted to mention your course, because what is the course that you're offering now at gigiyoung.com?
Yeah, so I have a few courses. I have 3. So I have basic intuition development that basically anyone can benefit from. And then I have psychic protection, which educates you on how to kind of understand the astral realm and, kind of get through any fear and just be educated about psychic work. And then I have deepening intuition, which is more advanced, which is really getting you to feel your different senses and identify them, and really some techniques to help you really work with them, work directly with every sense to get you in there. So I have 3 right now. I'm working on another one, but I got taken away with in plain sight. So
and it's a really engaging project, I can imagine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Those courses are very interesting, and I have to say, when I've talked to people who've taken those courses, they've always had incredible things to say about it. So I can only imagine, but just fantastic. You can find those at gigiyoung.com. I highly recommend it. Now, Miss Olivia.
Are you ready for questions yet?
No, I'm not. I'm just checking in with you. I'm taking the temperature because it's great to have.
I have a good question here from David Donaway.
Yes.
Are the blueprints for CERN et al. From another dimension?
Wow. Gigi, you were saying that it's like they've contacted this other thing and they've been working on it.
I feel like this is what I intuitively feel, is that they've actually, these groups, it's like generational. So there's these groups that have been in contact with harmonic forces in the 8th sphere for a very long time, and they've been given guidance on how to evolve technology in a certain way so that these forces can basically assert more and more control over the earth. And so it's been for, I don't know, probably Steiner would know exactly how long, but at least centuries on how to develop process by process. Like first you build this, and then you understand this, and then you can build a particle accelerator, and then you build a bigger one, and then you do that. And I think that there's channeling going on to give people, this guidance on, and I believe that they believe that they're summoning like a god. The great old ones are like a god. Like that's what they believe. They don't realize that that's not what's going on. Like they're being duped. And so it's a tragic thing all around for everybody.
The price to pay. It's kind of like making a deal with the mafia at the end. It's like, the black magic mafia is going to show up.
Exactly.
You brought up something interesting when we touched on the 8th sphere recently. And I want to talk about this in relation to CERN. We're going to try to draw all 3 of these together. During Aleister Crowley's work, during his searches around magic, which deteriorated into him being a really large-scale black magician. But before that, with Mathers and Golden Dawn, they had learned, and I like to remind everyone that the Golden Dawn comes out of these scrolls that were found, that were left by this abbot Valentinus, which is exactly where we get steganography from. So all these things and their relationship are fascinating. But in Golden Dawn, there are all these magic rituals and all the rest of it. And so Crowley goes gradually on that tip, and then his work gets darker and darker. But as he's going darker and darker, at one point he runs across a character, Gigi, named Lamb. L-A-M-M. And you've seen Lamb, and you mentioned something interesting, which is you said he looked very much like a gray alien.
Lamb, I believe that Lamb actually is a gray alien.
Yes.
And it's funny because I think that I think that they were communicating essentially with these gray aliens. Because if you look at Lamb, he has a very enlarged head, very enlarged cranium, just like a gray, kind of like the eyes. or at least some humanoid form that was devolving into a gray. So that's what I think that actually is. And I think
he does.
that,
He looks like he's at a midway point of some sort. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to go Google it, it's Lamb, Lam. Is it Lamm or Lam?
I think it's 2 M's. Yes.
Yeah, lamb. And which is kind of strange because, you know, Christ was a lamb, and it's sort of this weird, there's some kind of weird things, always perverted, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and then it kind of gets me thinking that obviously the grays have a sordid connection with humanity, and part of their connection is very, very dark. And it is that they are actually the aspect of humanity that essentially did not evolve. They actually went full into transhumanism, full into the 8th sphere. They believed that they just fell for it. And as a result, they devolved. They lose their sexual organs. Their heads become extremely large because that's the only thing they use. They no longer use the heart. Their bodies atrophy because they're just giving all their energy into machines. And if you resonate with that energy, you're going to contact that energy, unfortunately. And so it's kind of like there's this time travel aspect going on, because when you move interdimensionally, there is no time. So there's this kind of calling out for these maybe aspects of our own self.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even Ahriman, I actually feel like, I mean, even Ahriman has these jagged features, and he still has that kind of bigger head too.
No question. No question. Pointy features, very large head, unusual fingers in Steiner sculptures. We've shown these before, 6 fingers, which, you know, I mean, I guess that's the least strange thing about him. It is interesting, though, because Ahriman, according to Steiner, and we're going to go now into anthroposophy's cosmology on this. According to Steiner, there's a portion, Gigi, where the moon is leaving Earth. And it's such a trauma that this is when Ahriman joins with Earth and gets basically the upper hand on humanity by kind of becoming part of it. And this was a period where we were largely sort of, let's say, undefended. And that this is the thing of humanity throwing off. Steiner often talks about in facing Ahriman, not eschewing and running from, but in facing and going through it. And basically the Ahrimanic force actually being enriched, in a sense, by having faced off against us, sort of purifying that force, strangely enough. This is a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah, it absolutely. I think we have to look at it in a multifaceted way. We have to look at it in a really grounded, serious way, where we really look at the micro details like CERN and how it's going on and really take responsibility. But we also have to look at the spiritual way to have that perspective and that kind of release as well, understanding that it is serving us. It's, you know, it is, we do need the contrast in order to form. And Ahriman serves as kind of like the bad guy at the end of the video game, or he's the epitome or the collection of all of our shadow for this era. He's gathered it all up, and it isn't him, and anything underneath him is an aspect of him, just like it is of God. So he's kind of this figure that's lording this over us, but we resonate with him because he's reflecting to us in a personified aspect of our shadow. And whenever I see the moon leave the earth, I remember that. And it's like when the moon left, humanity changed, but there was a lot of humanity that had a lot of pain and trauma, and things weren't healed. A lot of things weren't healed. There were a lot of loose parts. And so it's kind of like it's that energy that created that. Or it's not the moon, but it's sort of like the process of the moon, or
yes,
an etheric kind of energy that almost allowed the moon to leave to begin with, you know, or it's that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting the way you're speaking about it, because when Steiner looks at these things, he's talking very much about them as spheres. And he said to look at them just physically is absurd. If you want to just study their most mineral aspects, big deal in a sense. That the orb, the sphere itself, has properties which relate to our spiritual evolution. In mystery school teachings of anthroposophy, you are, when you leave Earth, you go through a series of reincarnations through the planets, and you come back. And this is the whole process. You go through them almost like schools. And the eighth sphere then becoming an artificial version of that, people who are locked into the eighth sphere during their earthly lives move into this sphere, and then they come directly back to Earth. There's no moving on and developing and, you know, going through these other facets of evolution. And instead, they become more and more trapped in the eighth sphere. I have a few quotes here from Steiner on the eighth sphere before we get to your questions, Olivia, about the eighth sphere, because this might help. Okay, there's a series of lectures by Rudolf Steiner called The Occult Movement in the 19th Century. Again, he's seeing theosophy as the mystery schools going public, in a sense, with the compromise of Helena Blavatsky, who was an incredibly gifted individual. And I have some things here about her. I wanted to point out, too, that when we look at this image of Annie Besant, and then we're looking over here at Colonel Olcott, they are utilizing these X ceremonies as a way of bringing that X-steganography into the next level. From the mystery schools come back out, it's embedded in the original, the X is embedded in the original Theosophical logo, which was eventually kind of ripped off by the Nazis in a different fashion, but it was a kind of a swastika with a totally different meaning, of course. So this is Steiner's kind of first opening on this. He says, it's very difficult indeed to speak about the so-called eighth sphere, which was referred to openly for the first time by A.P. Sinnott. One cannot say that he gave information about it, for what he said was a fallacy. You can certainly realize why it is so difficult to speak about this subject, for again, it must be emphasized that our language has been coined for the outer material world, and the eighth sphere was regarded as a secret matter until it was mentioned by Sinnott. At another point, Steiner mentions that this is the highest secret in the mystery schools. Why is this one so secret, Gigi?
I think because it's so important that, and also because it has to do with the shadow. And there's a very delicate way of working with the shadow and addressing the shadow. And if you introduce someone to a shadow concept too soon, it'll only reinforce the shadow itself. And people actually also may create false notions about the eighth sphere. So if you were to introduce it too soon, you could misunderstand it, and then you could completely create an idea that's actually part of the eighth sphere because it's an illusion. And then so it's
like
kind
illusion on illusion. Yeah.
You're told it before you're ready, so you create this idea about what you think it is because it's a very difficult like how you incarnate again, how you die is very difficult for human beings to remember in this age when we're having difficulty even sensing our heart. You know, so if you introduce it too soon, it can actually do more harm than good. But also the dark nature of the eighth sphere is very hard for people who are already in a state of collective trauma and overwhelmment to actually do anything with or to actually understand. So human beings have to kind of be on a path that's a little closer to recovery, they have to be on an awakening path to understand it, because then there's going to be people on the planet who can understand it and talk about it properly or help people. You know, it has to be at a time where there's enough light to process it so it doesn't get distorted or that people just don't reject it, or it could totally serve the eighth sphere to be told too soon. Because the fear, you tell people, by the way, there's this eighth sphere that you're going to go to, if you misbehave and if you can't do this and that. And that sits in people's minds, and it makes people afraid. And so people have to have some kind of sense of self in order to process that idea. Some type of spiritual, at least some people on the planet do, before you start talking about things like that.
Fascinating. It is. It's like you enter the eighth sphere by fantasizing about it.
So then you create a fantasy because you don't understand it. You're not capable of understanding it. So you create a fantasy, which serves the eighth sphere. So it's very delicate. It's a very delicate. These shadow things are the most. There's so many spiritual teachers that get people obsessed with the shadow, and they pursue it aggressively, and that's it's a real thing.
Yeah. And you might go to the eighth sphere if you call out Oprah on Twitter, for example. A little more on the eighth sphere from Steiner. I really like that, though, Gigi, because it brings us around to how we should think about it, that we need the knowledge base in order to speak intelligently about it. So being aware of it first, but then also it not being a piece of this kind of fear programming. Quote, "You will have realized from the lecture yesterday," this is Steiner, "that the eighth sphere cannot be anything that belongs to the material world." This is very important. "For I have shown you that the greatest fallacy in Sinnott's statement is that the physical moon is directly connected with the eighth sphere. Sinnott's statement is that the physical moon is directly connected with the eighth sphere, and I tried to make it comprehensible that the actual foundation of the error consists in the fact that this pointed to something material and physical. From this, you'll be able to conjecture, even if not fully to understand, that what is called the eighth sphere can have nothing directly to do with anything within the material world. That is to say, what can be perceived by man's senses and thought out on the basis of sensory perception. This has no part in the eighth sphere. It will be useless to look for the eighth sphere anywhere in the material world."
Can I hop in?
Yes.
Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about this flat Earth stuff.
Yes.
Okay. Is this
this is where they come in finally.
Or that we're living in a simulation.
Right.
And more I'm experiencing, I know other people are experiencing synchronicities or coincidences that are kind of eerie, like you'll say something and there it pops up, as if AI is in control already, reading our thoughts and then manifesting things. All that has absolutely quickened in the last 10 years.
Yeah, well, they might be experimenting. This is interesting. I want to hear what you think of this, Gigi, actually, because they may be experimenting with this at a point. Dr. Farrell talks about experimenting with the medium, which is where he thinks the Mandela effect came from, and that they wanted to see if people's perception about a thing would actually change it, which we know in physics it does. But they wanted to see, if you mention that, James Brown is dead and he's not, or if you mention that he's alive when he's dead, does that change the actual physical reality? But this seems to me to cross over into that territory, Miss Olivia.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't think that we live in a flat Earth, but I mean, so people are like, God, no, flat Earth. No, I don't mean, okay. But on a certain level, I mean, anybody who's gotten stoned once, or had done psychedelics knows that, there's, you start to see that things are an illusion and things bend, and
this is how we can get
into the Matrix. It's,
no question about it.
I can understand why flat earthers come up with that, because they're experiencing a phenomenon and they're trying to explain it.
Well, this is interesting. I'm actually want to hop in on this for a minute with flat Earth. I believe, the thing is, with NASA has lied so much about the environment out there, and the development of the secret space program has kept everything so locked down that you can kind of make up anything about space, in a sense, including the fact, space doesn't exist. But it's also, the flat Earth thing is the ultimate, right? Because you'd go to a point where you'd say everything is a lie. It's just like, it's the ultimate, because, I don't need to prove anything. I just need to say everything's a lie. And then you're like, oh yeah, there's, we're living in a dome. So there's all of that stuff, and it's somebody's concoction. But really, at the root of it is, because in a public way, they've been so secretive about space, and NASA has kept things like ruins or whatever it happens to be. In places like Mars, we've had people like Richard Hoagland, study that aspect of it. It's pretty interesting to me because that's where I think those things come from. That excessive secrecy, like it breeds this kind of incredible distrust and then this fantasy aspect on top of it. It doesn't. It just has that feel to it. Really interesting.
Well, again, the real challenge, this always comes down to people want certainty. It's a very difficult thing to live in a state of uncertainty emotionally. And it's the challenge of our times, right? Because our reality is dissolving right in front of us.
True.
And we have been lied to. And it's like that quote from the CIA director, William Casey, right? About, the quote.
Our work will be complete when everything the American people believe is what we've told them.
Right. And so people are feeling that if I've been lied to about so much, that I'm just going to believe the opposite, right? Because that's certainty for them. If it's not white, that's black.
Yeah, but that's actually...
because it's certain. They want to be certain about something because the shades of gray are very disconcerting. But then again, Gigi, this is all about going within, right? This is about finding truth inside of yourself, which is so hard. And most people do not have the technology for that.
That's the whole thing, is like we are actually the eye of the storm. Mm-hmm. And everything spins around us, but we have to actually invest in that through meditation, through contemplating spiritual work, like we're doing Steiner today. Through contemplation and through meditation, we realize that we're the eye of the storm and that everything is just kind of spinning around us. I mean, there are some people who manage incredibly well in the worst times possible. Why is that? Luck? Not always. It's not always luck. It's a level of masterfulness. And we can, as humans, reach that level where we're not just subject to every, bizarro conspiracy theory that comes, or like even a pathological conspiracy mindset. It's something that hopefully we'll get over soon.
Wow, that is fascinating. One thing you can be certain of, flat earthers, is you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It is episode X76. We're going deep here with Gigi Young on Rudolf Steiner, the Eighth Sphere, and Ahriman in the battle of the Eighth Sphere. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, because when we talk about rolling into 2020 and that incredible takeover of the technology, and Amazon has announced, they're going to open the first Whole Foods with just robots. We're looking at it. We're actually in this period that the mystery schools over 150 years have set up for, one way or another. So we're already in this phase. We're in this period, and now we have the ability to utilize the teachings to navigate this particular period, because it puts a strain on us from a soul perspective, spiritually, as a community, on the financial aspects even. It's very interesting how this works. There was something that Steiner was talking about where he used the term soul mood. And Gigi, in 2020, the soul mood in America in particularly, but also in many other countries, there's a kind of foreboding going along with all of this.
The timelines are tightening. The energy is tightening, and it's been progressively tightening, which is why we've seen so much, political, stuff going on. Is they're having trouble adjusting. They're having trouble adjusting too. They don't want to be battling it out in front of the public like this.
Right.
They're having trouble adjusting. We need to realize that and be like, let's come together. They're having trouble. These two factions are fighting. Let's come together under something. So
yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's the opportunity. It's the window there. And it might only be a brief window.
But it's our window. And you know what? This is the most incredible thing. And this is why whenever people have spiritual experiences, they're blown away. It's natural to us. The environment that we're in is unnatural. How we're living is unnatural. It hurts us.
Right.
What we're talking about considering things like the Eighth Sphere, or just like a little bit more of a spiritual life, more organic, more community. These things are natural to us. It's not a big leap. We're not recreating the wheel.
Mhm.
We're not, and I think that's so important. That's so important to know, is like where we are is unnatural, and it's harder to be where we are than it is to just sort of simplify into more of an organic place.
Absolutely.
You know, in every way, including spirituality, which actually is our organic state. The moment that people start being in nature more and eating healthier and taking care of themselves, they begin to feel spiritual energy again. Their whole consciousness changes. So it's natural.
No question. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so it seems to me everybody's having that we're at a point where we are incredibly alienated from one another. Everyone is talking about that. And obviously we have different political groups who won't talk and work with each other anymore. How we have to change that. How do we start coming together? How do we start congregating and finding solutions and just creating coherence with each other?
Yeah, well, you're doing it right now, right?
We try to do it on the show, but how do we
do
get that
it
to spread out?
worldwide? How do we make the world one large dark journalist show?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is, we have to kind of have, I think it's through compassion. I think if we can try to look at people we don't agree with a bit more compassionately, and again, the civility is really important. We have to start prioritizing this concept of being civil to one another, because if we're not civil to one another, if we don't respect one another, we have no shot in picking out the actual dark people. If everyone just kind of doesn't respect one another, then we have no shot, and we have to consider that as well. And I think giving more and more attention to leaders who have the capacity to lead. Because again, there are people who, do good media. Like this show is amazing. You in one show, you guys roll out more stuff than some alternative channels do in a month.
Right.
So giving that focus there, but we also have to respect the time that we're in. But I think small things, compassion, kindness, like you said, Olivia, put yourself in their shoes. So many people, this is the most incredible thing. This is the human side of things that we have lost. Is that the moment that you are just kind to somebody, oh my God, sometimes they just melt. Sometimes they don't, but a lot of the times the people are so aggressive and so miserable is because they actually haven't had kindness. They haven't had compassion. They haven't had someone listen. They haven't had that energy. No one's cared.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. It's a great deficit.
They're human. We're humans. And so don't, push people don't dehumanize people into, dark alliances, or this is a good person, this is a bad person, because that allows that 2-minute hate to go on. We're human. Even the worst people, we have to approach with compassion. We don't, you can't do it any other way.
No question about it. There is a way to compassionately call someone out. And call that political corruption out.
We don't want people radicalizing,
Yes.
When you're just always, it's so aggressive and it's so, humiliation. Let's humiliate this person. Let's cancel this person. That's toxic for society. That creates fear. We need compassion. But we also need boundaries. It's not about being too soft. That's not what it's about. It's about not radicalizing people. It's about listening so we can actually understand what people are going through, create solutions. And it's those energies that allow people to start flowing and not reacting, which is where we need to be.
Well, you get an opportunity at the beginning of a year to really set the tone. So I really hear that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on episode X76. I want to highly recommend that you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, and that's the only way that we can really guarantee that we'll stay in touch, as we've seen with Miss Olivia's Twitter, and we do hope to have her Twitter back online shortly. But really, that was largely the effect of, basically large-scale censorship by Silicon Valley, and we're getting used to it to such a point that it's absurd. They threw off a number of conservative Twitter activist people, or just actors or whoever, who thought that in a particular vein. But then, and I was watching that, and a lot of people were saying to me, oh, you know, the great conservative lynching is happening. They're going after these people. And then, interestingly enough, I started looking into people like Press for Truth and stuff, who were the hardcore, you know, the real left stuff. And they'd done stuff, documentaries and things out of Canada. And there they were censoring those people too. So it is not a right-left divide. It is anyone who speaks outside of this very narrow, absurdly, I can't even call it politically correct because it's just so absurd. If you get outside of that window, you know, I'll call it the Davos crowd, billionaire correct. If you get outside of that window, I mean, and let's face it, you know, Twitter's not reality. It's not at all. Like I said with the Sharon Stone headline, they're creating their kind of own little weird eighth sphere in there, and the value systems are absurd, you know. Of course, they allow all this incredible like pornography and things like that, but you make one comment about a celebrity and they're going to take you off. So we're working with a power dynamic where the people who are controlling, you know, the capability of the people at the top has just kind of dropped to such a level. And Fitz calls them, you know, insane. Mm-hmm. This is her definition for where those people are at this point. Yes.
Okay, I want to ask a question right now. So Michael Snow said, how does the filth believe that they will protect themselves from the 5G death towers? This is a big question that I have about, I'm just going to put out there, basically the global eugenicists, after we vermin are, you know, scrubbed from the surface of the earth, right? They're going to inherit a polluted earth. You know, they and their children and their grandchildren are going to be radiated by these 5G death towers. What are they thinking? Gigi, do you have any ideas about this?
Yeah. So this is like what we were talking about earlier, how it's what we're dealing with is possession. And I have a video on my YouTube channel where I talk about that even though on the outside we all look the same, and I'm not saying this to be divisive in any way, I'm just saying this because there are spectrums of the personality. Even though we all kind of look the same on the outside, there's different types of spiritual connection that we can have.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're actually connected to very different things. And there's some people that are possessed by the light and some people by the darkness. And when you're possessed by the eighth sphere and darkness, you behave in a completely different way. And you have a completely different view of reality. And the whole goal is if the earth is inhabitable, just add pieces of machine to your body. This being that they are communicating with, that they are contacting, perhaps through CERN and other devices, is an AI being. And they don't like anything organic. They want everything to be synthetic, including humanity. And so that involves smothering the earth with different technologies and destroying that energy. This is a battle between, you know, dark and light. You know, it's difficult to hear, but this is sort of, they don't care if humanity is organic anymore. In fact, they don't want that. So that's something that, you know, the people who are involved in this probably have some kind of plans to put themselves in a machine, thinking that this is going to exalt them and their children, not realizing that they will completely lose everything they have.
Right. And it's very interesting, actually. That's putting it where it is. What's interesting is this thing that they're talking about, the singularity, where they merge with machines, is exactly that. They think that the machines will make them immune from things like 5G towers. But just like with Elon Musk saying, well, I can project my consciousness into this, you know, Neuralink, and my whole consciousness will be in this little cube. I mean, it is incredibly disconnected. Those people, and especially a guy like Elon, would understand fundamental mystery school stuff. Just the basics, you know, chakras, a third eye, whatever. Your ability to be a spiritual being in a physical body comes through your endocrine system and those energy centers. You can't project that into a cube. You just, I mean, you know, whatever they're talking about projecting in there, it might be some aspect of your intellect, but it's got nothing to do with who you are as a human being.
Oh, that's such a good point. And even like when it comes down to like endocrine stuff, they are obsessed with endocrine secretions and things like that as well, because your endocrine system actually does contain certain qualities. And so you would completely degrade, yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really dangerous, and it's bizarre. I mean, people like Elon Musk will tweet like, let's nuke Mars, and like, let's plug ourselves into machines, and like this weird death cult will be like, yeah, it's completely strange.
It is. Right.
Like,
What are you conjuring? What are you conjuring there?
where
Yeah.
are we?
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of quick quotes from the Eighth Sphere lecture by Steiner, and then we're going to jump to Olivia's questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here with Gigi Young, going deep now for a deep dive into the Eighth Sphere and its message for 2020, the battle with the Ahrimanic force coming in, and Steiner's information, the mystery schools bringing forward that contrary wall, that ability for us to have some kind of a bulwark against this incredible onslaught, and giving us the knowledge, giving us the know-how, the lay of the land before it all hits. I think it's quite an important way to put it. So I'm going to skip here to how he describes what the Eighth Sphere, how it came to be used as a term in the first place, which I think is kind of interesting. So how was it the expression, this is from Steiner's lecture, how was it that the expression the Eighth Sphere came to be used? You know that human evolution takes its course through the seven spheres of Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan. This is the cosmology and anthroposophy. We will conceive that besides these seven spheres, there is still something else which lies outside of them, and yet is in some way related to the Earth. Here, then, we have a sphere, visible only to visionary, imaginative clairvoyance, which stands there as an eighth sphere over and above the seven which constitute the domain of the ordered and regular evolution of mankind. Further, all such sketches are, of course, purely diagrammatic. This is he puts up that sketch that I showed earlier. One is obliged to draw separately spheres which can be observed each within the others, for you will certainly have realized from our studies that as long as a man or woman is within the material world, and they make their observation through the senses and thinks with the intellect, then he is standing in the fourth sphere, the Earth. If he develops his faculties of soul sufficiently to be able to see the third sphere, the Moon, then he takes a far flight, but not in the spatial sense. He observes not from another place, but physically speaking, spatially speaking, from the same place. These seven spheres ought therefore in reality to be drawn within one another. They are successive stages and states of evolution, and fundamentally, such a diagram is of no other value than as if one were to say human beings develop from birth to seventh year at a first stage, from seventh to the 14th year in a second stage, and so on. The being who has developed from the first to the seventh year cannot be thought of as separate from the being who is developing from the seventh to the 14th. Neither is it correct to think of the other seven successive spheres or stages of the Earth's evolution as separate from each other. They all consist of a chain. Quote, this will give you an inkling that the eighth sphere is to be observed within the Earth sphere. It cannot properly be drawn either above or below to depict the reality. It would have to be sketched within the Earth sphere. Gigi, it's here. You're surrounded by the eighth sphere.
Yeah, that's incredible. The way you read it, I finally got that. You must have transferred something. But yeah, that's crazy. So we're in it, and it's amongst us. And the only thing that really separates us is our mind and how we position ourselves, perhaps.
Right. And if I were to look at this, and from the point of view of saying, in our everyday lives, we have the opportunity of not going into the eighth sphere. I believe a lot of it has to do with not going into that imaginative virtual reality that is being thrown down upon everyone. You know, everywhere people go, they're getting that in. Now, if I watch TV or if I watch a movie or something like that, it makes an impact on you in any case. However, if somebody is nonstop on a device or in a video game, or if they're completely obsessed and plugged into it, then I think that's kind of moving into that sphere. I think that the separation level no longer exists, whereas I think you can watch a movie and you can sort of observe something or read a book or whatever it happens to be, but still maintain that level of separation.
Yeah, because you're doing something kind of consciously or unconsciously. I think the intention, really matters, but there's such a difference between like just having a break and resting and watching a movie, or like just relaxing and escaping and wanting to just disassociate. And it's almost like maybe there's a precise magical action that happens when you say, I don't want to be here. And you disassociate consciously or unconsciously. And then you're like, okay, well, I guess you're going here. And you're going to be wherever your resonance is. I don't know if that's making sense, but it's like a disassociation that is a magical action within itself. We're so spiritually sensitive, we don't realize thoughts are things.
Absolutely.
And our soul moves with our mind, and we don't realize that, what we're creating and what we're doing.
We're projecting ourselves in. And in the case of someone, who may be like a drug addict or who may live in a pure fantasy life, they are getting in such a way that it's going to be hard to get out.
Well, yeah, because we're dangling so precariously, because a lot of people just don't even know what their own heart feels like and what their own soul. We can't even contemplate our soul in its entirety, but just moment to moment, we don't know how to connect with our spirit, or we don't know our identity. The first part of intuition development is actually getting you to meditate and sense your own spirit, your own heart, take risks in the direction of what you think your spirit is saying, to develop a rapport with your spirit. And then so when you pass over or things get weird, you know who you are, and you're not going to fall prey to the eighth sphere, because you haven't just invested in a fantasy to the point that you have no idea who you are. You don't know what your heart feels like. You don't know what your soul feels like. You don't know what higher energy feels like to lower energy. You just literally disassociated, projected your entire life into something else that you actually can't censor. You don't actually have an identity anymore. And that's because where your energy goes, where your attention goes, your energy flows. So if you're not investing in yourself and your spiritual evolution, it's like you're abandoning yourself and you can't sense yourself, which is a problem when it comes to spirituality and even death. So.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Well, Storm Boy wanted to ask, how do we remember who we are? And you sort of just answered that question, but I also wanted you to address that from a Gurdjieffian perspective about self-memory.
Well, what's interesting is one of the great techniques that comes out of the Gurdjieff work is self-remembering. Oh. And the way that Ouspensky drew it was an arrow pointing to the outside world on one end, and then on the other end, the arrow back at yourself. And in the Gurdjieff work, you have a wheel of eyes, and each personality is not aware of the other. And so there's a number of things that happen in daily life that move that wheel in a kind of haphazard fashion, and different aspects of your personalities come out. The self-remembering cuts down on that, and it allows for something called a magnetic center to form, so that you and your genuine interests, your genuine likes, the actual person that you're here to become starts to form a center. And so the self-remembering is kind of like a conscious meditation. The meditation that you're talking about, Gigi, is that real centering. And I think that's the important thing that everyone's missing, even a few minutes a day. The self-remembering seems to me to be like an adjunct. It is in your day-to-day life, because it's interesting to think of the Gurdjieff work. You're in the fourth way, and the fourth way requires you to be in everyday life. You're not away in a monastery. You're not studying some special, walking on hot coals or lying on a bed of nails way of transcending. You are in everyday life, and you have to be in the force of everyday life in order to do it. That's why the self-remembering comes in. But that's pretty much like a moving meditation, Gigi.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. So if people wanted to look into that, it's called self-remembering.
Self-remembering.
Gurdjieff, self-remembering.
Yeah, there's actually a great outline of it in Search of the Miraculous in Ouspensky's book.
Okay, so for people who are super grounded and are, really struggle with, like, you hear a New Age person be like, blah, that's a good practice, is the self-remembering. And then for people who I would say are more empathic and more spiritually driven, and they feel things very viscerally, you want to really get into like the feeling body. But no matter where you are in your process, if you meditate every day, and there's so many different beautiful types of practices, whether it be like Zen or Vipassana, if you meditate every day, you will begin to get glimmers of who you are. You'll get answers about what you need to eat in your diet. You'll get answers about problems you have in your life. You'll experience synchronicities, because by nature, meditation allows you to hold an increasingly higher frequency in your body. But it also allows you to observe what the difference between a thought is, and choose, like, observe your thoughts, but choose whether you want to invest in thoughts rather than reacting all the time, which is really, really important, because we're not our reactions. And if we follow our reactions and just become instinctual, we're always investing in the wrong energy, which is the 8th sphere. So meditation is, 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night, absolutely imperative, and you will see yourself connecting.
Incredible. Wow. What an incredible benefit for such little time invested. Miss Olivia.
Are we ready for questions?
Yes.
Are you going to bring up Archangel Michael?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best.
We're going to get to that later? Okay. So Zoe Fish wants to know, how would Gigi suggest starting Ascension?
Starting Ascension. Well, I think that we are already moving in a cosmic way. We're always subject to the cosmos, and I think it's just becoming aware. I think it's becoming aware. Yeah, I mean, things really accelerate in our lives when we become aware of our cosmic elements and our cosmic self. It's that alignment, really. That's what creates acceleration, is when we finally make that connection. Like what he was saying with the remembering with Gurdjieff, or whether it be a more, whatever it is. Whenever you reach that alignment, it's the alignment that creates acceleration. There's no asserting, there's no aggression, there's no action, there's no busyness, there's no doing. First you align, and then you find that action begins to flow to you in a more accelerated way. It's aligning first, and then you'll find that the cosmos starts moving around you, like, what DJ was saying with creating that magnetic center. You got to get in the magnetic center first, and then you'll find that you can kind of control your reality a bit more. But it's not that we have to try to ascend, it's that we have to kind of realize where we are in that process and connect with it.
Fascinating. Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
On that note, Najat Madri wanted to know, any possibility that Steiner et al. Souls will return in different form to help humanity in their development?
Oh, absolutely. As in reincarnation? Yeah.
Well, is Steiner overseeing any of this? Is he helping us so that we don't fall into the 8th sphere trap?
I have to mention here, it's kind of interestingly enough, that Gigi, when you've spent time working on this material, that presence of Steiner has come in at times.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel his presence around me, and he will come around. And I think he would come around people who were genuinely wondering, and will work with you too. Yeah.
Steiner was, what I want to say is, like a very high adept who was very humble in his role. But when we think of the impact that he made and the ability to even take the chaos of the Theosophical Society and the incredible things that they had brought forward, but then were degenerating, and to take the kind of chaos of that and move it forward so that the mission didn't falter, in a sense, was a Herculean task. So we really, that kind of an influence we can see, just like Blavatsky's, the kind of the basic shadow of the work that they did over what we are doing here in the 21st century. I mean, their legacy runs incredibly long, and it starts really when Blavatsky founds with Emma Britton, the Theosophical Society with Henry Olcott in 1875. And we're literally talking 145 years ago.
That's incredible. And I mean, the foresight is, I mean, when you're working on a psychic level, every tiny little thing that you do and say and predict it is magnified because you're working in several levels of time. So you have to compound everything that you're doing. So when you see somebody that's able to make predictions and create something like biodynamic farming and put in place teachings about Ahriman, when he's not in that time, he's not in that era, and to do it in a grounded way is an incredible psychic accomplishment that I don't think people will really realize until later. But everything that you try to do kind of compounds, like every small thing you do compounds with time. So to do predictions at that level is really, it's kind of like transcendent.
Wow, absolutely incredible. Yes.
I want to say also, just I've done tons of healing work. That what this is about density, right? On some level, and I have to say, a couple years ago, I did a series of healings, and it's not so much the healer, but it was the intention that I went in, and I did an exercise because I was ready to release a lot of old pain and trauma, things, anchors, basically. And I went through my entire life, and I said goodbye. I honored every experience, major experience I could think of, good and bad, and then I took them and I put them into a shredder in my mind, and I shredded them and I released them basically to the universe. That changed me so much. And I am disconnected now. When I look back on my life, that seems like another life, like I was sort of born again in a way. I know the memories are there, but I don't feel attached to them. So that was a form of healing for me. I was obviously ready for that. I felt like that I was really ready for that.
Well, that's a remarkable breakthrough.
It was, and I recommend everybody do it. That's another technique you could try if you feel ready for it. I think what's really important is that you don't do it like, get rid of this. I'm tired of thinking about this old trauma, whatever it is, but to really honor it all and lovingly put it into the shredder. So
now I know why you're so fond of the shredder here in the studio.
I love the shredder.
Unbelievable. It's incredible, though. I know exactly what you mean. And the timing of it is really interesting also, because it's almost like you were so ready for it that you created the environment.
Yeah, well, you can only hang on to pain, but this is what we're really talking about is pain and trauma. And, our friend Deborah always talks about generational trauma that, we all have inherited. And how do you release it, for the benefit of yourself and all of humanity? That's our responsibility so that we can create a future that's better than the past.
Fascinating. Wow, absolutely. Amazing. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X76. We're going to take a few questions here. And Miss Olivia.
Okay, this is a little off topic, but I want to ask it anyway. Cheryl Nella wanted to know, why do so many notable people cover one eye, either with hand or something else, while being photographed or filmed? Seems there is a broad directive for so many to be doing this. Gigi, what do you think?
You mean like Madonna?
There are posters.
Oh, yes.
You can't believe it. So what is that all about?
Well, that's like it's insane. It's a completely ritualistic thing. And I think it has a couple different incarnations. It's like kind of like the weird, like all-seeing eye. And it also matters, I think, like what side, is covered as well. I think that it's used in brainwashing. I think that it's used ritualistically. And I think it's used to pay homage and a nod to certain deities. I think there's like a more balanced version and an imbalanced version as well. I believe Odin, is it Odin who had the one eye?
Oh, I think so.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's mythologically it's recognized. But yeah, it's used in ritual in a lot of different ways. And it always kind of weirded me out. The guy who is the king of Satanism, I think his name's like Luchin or something like that. He is blind in one eye.
Oh, LeVay.
No, the guy who inherited it.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Right.
So there's definitely something going on here. Do you have any more of an exact, what do you think it is?
I'll tell you what's interesting is you and I did the outline for a show on the Manichaeans, and we're going to do that probably in February. And what I was getting from the Manichaean, which was this very unusual movement that started around 300 AD in Persia and spread out throughout Asia and used a lot of incredible mystery techniques. And in fact, the founder of it was in fact crucified after saying, well, he was better than Christ or Buddha or any of those guys that came before. He kind of wanted to wrap it all into one package. But what's interesting is when you go back there and you really see the amount of people that followed that when by the time 1000, or 1100 AD rolls around, you have thousands of people in Asia following this Manichaean. And so this wasn't just some fraud. This guy came out of a mystery school. He had taken those various techniques, and a lot of people have pulled this apart. And Steiner, when he was looking at the early Templar activity, and he was saying, well, the foundation of some of that sort of split in Masonry, where the symbols get used and all the rest of it, comes out of this Manichaean pulling these things out of the mystery schools and going off on their own. Like you said earlier, we were talking about left-hand path schools. They will adopt certain methods that they take out of these schools and start their own kind of technique using this stuff. But a lot of what Steiner was talking about in relation to what the Masonic masters were using, that some of those gestures that the masters and the lodges originally would use, an average person would faint in their presence. So the symbology runs that deep in our psyche, and they understand it. And so some of these groups that have come out, then they've misused those mystery techniques.
Ah, interesting.
So that's where we are with it. Miss Olivia.
Okay. So is Ahriman an egregore intentionally created, or is it a consequence?
I think he can create thought forms.
Okay, so who does Ahriman serve? What is his origin?
Well, it's interesting because you have to kind of check out the root origin of what we perceive as evil. Mm-hmm. But what we know from anthroposophy is that Steiner is a dark astral force that's deeply wound up with human evolution. So the force that we call the devil and these things, because he splits out Ahriman and Lucifer as two totally different forces. Mm-hmm. And Lucifer Gnosis, which is something else altogether. And the mission of humanity is to gather from these forces basically the knowledge from engaging with these forces for basically the larger Sun, Jupiter evolution, that we have to face that and go through it to create what he calls the warmth of Vulcan, to create this new Jupiter. Now, that's the cosmology. When you break it down on the Christian side and you look at things like New Jerusalem and the 144,000 and all the rest of it, it has to do, apparently, and this is spoken to also in Casey's version of Revelation, it has to do with breaking down the cellular structure of humanity and enlivening it with that spiritual consciousness. That's what the fundamental aspect is. That creates a different reality. So we might think of it as, hey, my physical body is going to Jupiter, but it is, in fact, you are recreating the elements that make you a spiritual physical being, and you are moving up that level. So in fact, when we look at it this way, Ahriman is like a force that has the opportunity, it figured out, to act like an evolutionary door for humanity. And it likes that position because it gets all the power and it gets all of the energy. And so it can harvest that humanity, and it becomes almost, basically like a super god itself. So it doesn't want to give up that position, and over again, it tries to harness and harvest humanity. So there we are in the middle of that battle. But the problem is that humanity, in anthroposophy, the problem is that humanity is facing this sleepy and unawares on the spiritual side, because we've been trained now through scientific materialism, to pay attention to those things that can be weighed and measured, but we're forgetting about no one's minding the store on the spiritual side. And so you're missing that, and this thing is coming in. So that's the great lesson that we're coming into. 2020, in a sense, is the eighth sphere. It's the setup for the eighth sphere battle, the Ahrimanic battle. And it seems to me the buffer against that is the anthroposophical information coming directly out of the mystery schools.
L. Smith wants to know, does Ahriman harvest our loosh? Everybody loves to talk about the loosh.
That's one way to put it.
I've heard that. Where does that come from? Does anybody know in the chat where exactly that?
I think it's Gnosticism.
Okay.
Oh, is it? I always thought it was David Icke, honestly.
Yeah, because I've only
one of the two.
I've only heard it in heavy, like kind of more conspiracy material. I can't think of where it actually exists in like in a text or something. If someone knows, then I'd like to know what
actually the term, drilling down the term is a great idea. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to take a few more questions. We've been going deep on the eighth sphere with Gigi Young. Gigi Young's work available at gigiyoung.com. Also her incredible, and I mean incredible series, In Plain Sight, dealing with some really deep and I would say some darker aspects to bring light to them. Gigi, you made the observation that our shows are coming closer and closer in a sense.
They're merging.
There you are, taking a deep dive off. But those episodes are very, very interesting. And really, I think so much of the insight you're bringing forward on that, I think it's very ahead of its time. And I highly recommend it to everyone. And we're going to take a few more questions here. I want to remind everyone, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Make sure that you're in that pipeline with us. We were just discussing what happened here with Olivia Wings Girl's Twitter, and this was really absurd. But you see how they can just kind of push the button. So let's go ahead and make sure that we're signed up there at darkjournalist.com. And what basically is going to happen, you're going to get an email about once a week letting you know what great shows we have coming up for you with amazing guests like we have tonight. Miss Olivia, a couple more questions.
Okay, I'm going to ask this one. Conscious for Now says, don't you think Steiner would be horrified by the resurgence of nationalism in the U.S. today? What do you think Steiner would have to say about nationalism and globalism?
Well, it's interesting because sovereignty and nationalism, because if you're talking about nationalism as imperialism, that's different. So a place having an identity is not a problem. So it's the interpretation of the word there. Would it be nice if there was like one large world where all the countries got along but maintained their distinct character? That would be what the original idea around the UN was, but the UN has been used instead to just, throw the natives from the various places off their land and move on in. And that means whether you're in the Middle East or South America or Europe or anywhere else. And then also the UN just oversees these wars where you get Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees, and they try to jam them into cultures that are very unfamiliar with them. And then you get a whole mismatch there. So you're causing all those problems. As we've seen throughout Europe, there's an incredible immigration problem. So really the UN has failed in its mandate over and over again. But I actually think the idea of a distinct character of a place and maintaining its identity is important. Remember, one of the things that the corporate leadership has tried to do is create these zones. They wanted the North America zone, which was going to be Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. And you can imagine the U.S. and Mexico have very different constitutions, but they just wanted to treat them as one zone. That means, guess what? You have to scrap the Constitution. Well, the Constitution is the leading document in the world for how we get a democratic republic. So therefore, those guys just want to see themselves in charge, as they've actually written in their own books. So the way that I look at that question is interesting, because in an ideal world, all the countries would be able to accept and trade with each other and work with each other. And that's really the point.
Yeah, and I think an important point too is that we talk about ancestral healing and identity. And it's very important that these aren't removed too soon, because we lose our ability to remember. And if we can't remember, we don't have that lexicon, that we can't evolve. Like Olivia was saying, she did ancestral healing and kind of went into her life, and she chose to dissolve certain things. She chose to keep certain things. Humanity needs to be given a chance to dissolve certain things and to keep certain things. And the idea that you can come in and move people ahead too fast is Ahrimanic. Ahriman wants to move everybody way too fast into something else. I mean, maybe as we evolve into New Jupiter, in Steiner's cosmology, as we evolve, you know, maybe we will consolidate in certain areas. Maybe we will release certain patterns. Maybe we will release certain things, but it has to be by our choice and by our organic growth. And that process is so important, and that process is being taken away from us. Even when I had my discussion with, you know, Corey Good, one of my things was that, why are you trying to disclose the truth to people? Why aren't you teaching people actual spiritual processes to remember and reconnect with spirituality?
Right.
Why are you telling people that don't know who they are yet, who they are, and creating a sense of urgency around it? This is black magic, and this is robbing us of our own history, and thus our own way to create a new sphere and back to ourselves. And so there's something very toxic about that. And it's not about racism or anything like that. It's about being given the choice to consolidate what we want to consolidate, release what we want to release, and create from our own selves.
Well, it's fascinating. And you mentioning some of the cult activity there, I can tell you from having dealt with individuals around that cult, like they were some of the lowest people I've ever encountered in my entire life. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we get these kind of criminals.
It's a technique. It's like, it's like this thing that when you go dark, this is what you do. You do it politically, you do it with war, it's like, that's the playbook, you know?
Absolutely. It's amazing. And what's fascinating is the packaging that we were talking about is at an all-time high for 2020. They need to seal the deal. You know, Edge of Wonder needs to resuscitate the corpse of the good cult. You know, they're pushing, there's this push, and TTSA needs Elizondo to be legitimate, even though on the record he's been proven to be a liar. You know, so this is the clash really in it. And they think, well, we've got the $50 million, we have the CIA backing, we bought a History Channel TV show, we can do it. You know, the New York Times is on our side. But in fact, this is the same thing that convinced them they could do Russian collusion with Trump. You know, it's their own kind of will to power, right? It's their own psychopathy in action. And in fact, they think that we can't see it. And I think that this is what's fascinating. We can see it very well. And this is the problem for them, which is we know the game. And at this stage, on the spiritual aspect, the same thing happened with anthroposophy, you know, when the Nazis try to eradicate Steiner's work. And when they try to burn down the Goetheanum and all the rest of it, it was the clash there because they knew that he knew what they knew and more. So therefore, you have to take somebody like that and their work out. And it's not often mentioned, and he didn't want to really advertise it, but Steiner was in fact poisoned at the end of his life. And it took him a few weeks to die in that process, and he basically swore everyone to secrecy about how it happened. But that's the way that this works, and that's the kind of guts, in a sense, that it takes to stand up spiritually.
Absolutely. And and I think you have to have the guts. You have to have the guts to stand up for what you think is right, and you have to keep doing it, even though people laugh, even though people tell you you're wrong. You know, you have to. That's what everything good was made out of.
Yeah, well, and think about a lot of the people that we're talking about, like Catherine Austin Fitts, for example, and, you know, facing up to that huge juggernaut trying to put her in prison for so many years. I mean, this is the quality of the people that are around this. And so this is the kind of information that we can get, that we do have access to. And frankly, the less distractions that we allow ourselves in that pursuit, the better. You know, the more pure the stream of the reality we're going to get. Miss Olivia, take a couple more questions and we're done.
Okay, this is a really intriguing question. Sam Raven, please ask Gigi how to bring in Hathor or Kali's protective mother's energies to enhance my life or defend it from trouble. It seems like, you know, what we all need is more goddess energy. What do you think about it?
Well, I wouldn't know how to invoke. I've never tried actually invoking Kali or doing any kind of like invocations with Kali or anything like that. But I've noticed the destructive, powerful presence in my life. And I just try to honor it when it comes forward and follow it and be with it. But I actually can't. I've never tried to invoke. I couldn't advise on that. That's
fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, I had a question for you, Gigi, and it comes out of this conversation we had about Lamb, oddly enough. But this idea of lack of development, this is something that happens with those left-hand schools. It is that they think the individual that they seduce, in that sense, the person who goes into that work, they become very much retarded in their development, and they kind of regress in this sense. So this is like an opposite evolution that's happening. You're actually evolving into the eighth sphere, but in the normal processes of things, you're devolving.
Yes, it's a false evolutionary path. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because well, you're very big on Star Wars, Miss Olivia.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that incredible scene when Darth Vader is dying and Luke says, I'm here for you. And he says, take off my mask. Mm-hmm. He says, if I take it off, you'll die. And he says, oh, I'm going to die anyway. Take it off. And then when he takes it off.
You're going to make me cry right now. I'm a sucker.
Well, Darth Vader is like this undeveloped kind of weird worm surrounded by all this technology. So, you know, the maker of the film, George Lucas, back then, before Disney took over and ruined all that stuff, he had it. I mean, he had that snapshot there. But that's what it does, which is that even the technology, if you don't engage with it, if it doesn't make you a better human being, you are devolving, in fact.
Yeah. Well, it's taking a lot of you that you should be developing.
Right. That's true. It was what?
He was kind of rotting in there.
He was rotting in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Stagnating and rotting, you know, in that suit.
I thought for a second you said that, but I was like, did she really say that?
No.
But that's a good metaphor for what happens.
Exactly.
Is decay, death, decomposition.
This is why the original Star Wars was so potent, because the archetypes were perfectly drawn. And that's why Joseph Campbell had such a reaction to it. It was wonderful.
In a hurry, in like 60 seconds or less, I want to introduce people to a couple of quick things. This is a woman named Rachel Carson, a very important anthroposophist who exposed the early effects of pesticides and literally got a number of pesticides taken off the market and grew that awareness dramatically based on her knowledge of biodynamic farming. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring.
That was a huge book.
Yes. And that was in 1962. I highly recommend this. But she understood that DDT, the pesticides they were using, based on her knowledge of Steiner's cosmology, the things about Ahriman and all the rest of it, she was able to put it into practical use. And that's how we have a lot of that knowledge. And back then, a lot of people were like, oh, we don't want to use that. That's where this came from. So anthroposophy, again, changing the conversation there. I want to mention this quote from a real leading futurist. And this is the one I mentioned that sent shivers up my spine because I just could not believe the guy was playing with a full deck. Okay, I've talked already about Kurzweil and that, you know, human beings will become more godlike. And as we become more machine-like and as machines develop more godlike powers, Kurzweil says that we humans are nothing special in the animal kingdom. We have no immortal soul. There you go. That's your first mistake. And there's no essential self, and our thoughts and emotions are the product of electrochemical impulses. which can in the future be modeled by algorithms. This is where they're going, Gigi.
Oh my God, Ahriman, is that you?
Exactly. And physically, they're starting to resemble each other. That's for sure. Okay. Ahriman.
Well,
and
this is
Kurzweil.
scientism. This is
scientism.
religion.
But like, you can basically say you can do anything you want. I mean, if we're just, you're giving yourself permission to do whatever you want to anybody,
There's a blog called Anthroposophical, which I think did an exceptional job linking up the AI aspects with Ahriman. And I'm going to take a quote from there. This is about Yuval Noah Harari. And he's somebody, as a futurist, who's really gained a lot of traction. And it's a lot of the humans are bad. Gee, wouldn't it be great for the animals if the humans were gone kind of thing. But it's really saying humans are bad. So, quote, another futurologist, Yuval Noah Harari, says it is a fact that the last days of Homo sapiens are fast approaching, and our species will be replaced by, quote, completely different beings who possess not only different physiques, but also different cognitive and emotional worlds. And he's not done. Ordinary human beings will become surplus to requirements as wars will be waged by drones and work and will be done by robots. Again, quote, some economists predict that sooner or later, unenhanced humans will be completely useless.
Oh.
If you're not enhanced, Gigi, you're out.
Well, no, because I think that people are actually going to start forming little communities and compounds where they honor organic life and they live very close. They would like you to think that that's their goal.
Yes.
But the reality is that if you can evolve organically and natural, you are way more powerful than anything else. There's nothing more powerful than that. So I think that there will be two streams of evolution, not one. But they're definitely directly channeling an harmonic society perspective. We're just electrical synapses firing. Like that's that's basically what they think a robot is. They basically already think we're robots, pretty much.
Exactly.
Just reducing us to electrical components, so they don't see a difference.
The spark of that humanity would go directly into the eighth sphere. I mean, it is the anthroposophical circle embodied. I mean, Yuval Noah Harari embodied Ahriman even better than Kurzweil did in his quote. Amazing. Yeah. Absolutely exceptional. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It's been incredible. It's great to have you here, Gigi. I want to remind everyone.
You know what? I don't want you to end yet.
No, hold on. I'm going to finish this part anyway. I want to remind everyone that so much of this information came from Steiner. Remember being a very humble student there with Besant for years, and her selecting him as the head of the Theosophical Chapter in Germany, which is very important in this sense, because although they split later, there was that combination of those two. And remember, Besant had that great impact on Gandhi, and she helped him overthrow British rule in India. This is how the mystery schools worked, sometimes imperfectly, trying to promote Krishnamurti as a Maitreya world teacher. But then later we got the incredible teacher Krishnamurti from that process. So again, not such a misfire, but the incredible work of Rudolf Steiner having come through that great teaching and really bringing the world now into a totally different knowledge of what these things represented, giving us that key for 2020, that clue to let us say this incredible onslaught of the technology here is something that you can work with. Ahriman and the eighth sphere. That's really kind of a crucial aspect. And he brought forward the biodynamic farming, the Waldorf schools, which are under attack now, as we realize. Let's keep him in mind as we start this year, and I think we'll have a good handle on it. Miss Olivia.
Okay, I want to go back for a second about Sam Raven's question. And here he is. He's asking about Hathor. I'll just put it out there. I think I've been a priestess of Hathor in a past life, so I have an affinity. I think, Sam, if you're drawn to a particular god or goddess energy, frequency, then there's a reason for that. And you have to feel like it's an invitation. So just go,
Well, Hathor
it's
has
organic.
the wonderful cow ears,
Yes.
right? She's very unusual, a figure in ancient Egyptian
So
mythology.
maternal goddess,
Yeah.
right? It is a mother goddess image, right? So
We can recommend the work of John Anthony West
Mhm.
on that, and we can also recommend Carmen Bolter's incredible knowledge of Egypt as well. Miss Olivia, we're out of time.
there's a story. There's a cute story that I have no idea
Yeah.
which book I got it from,
Uh-huh.
but it's an Indian story. And so there was an Indian who was meditating. This is in the Far East India, and he was trying to connect to a particular guru who had passed. It was, I don't know if it was, or whether it was Krishna or someone. So anyway, he would spend all this time in meditation trying to invoke this being. And then he wouldn't come to him. And every time he'd do it, he'd spit on the ground. And he did this for years. And finally, this entity came to him covered in his own spittle. And I just think it's really interesting sort of showing him. I was always there. I was always waiting, watching, and here I
Very
am.
interesting.
It's something to contemplate. But I do think that there's something to putting your heart out there, putting the effort in, putting the time in trust and in faith that a connection will be made. You have to put in the work first. That's your leap of faith, and then they come and join you.
I don't think there's any doubt about it, and that's great advice, actually. It's interesting with the stories too.
Yeah, and I think that in ancient times we had a different idea about what a god was than what we do now. So we're in a very literal age. And so
Yes.
but I think in our ancient history, I think we recognize that the gods were aspects of ourselves. And I think that there were times where they became literal and had incarnations and things like that, but there was an understanding that that was a part of ourself. And I think that in our society, whenever we try to invoke something, whenever we try to connect something, please know the foundation is that it's first a part of yourself. So when he showed up with a spittle on him, he was always there, not because he was there from the outside as an external being, but because he was always there, part of us. It's a part of us. And so it's important to know, if you're doing any work, that there's a part of you that will come forward and speak, or that it's first an inward thing.
Absolutely. Wow. Fascinating. Miss
I
Olivia.
have one more thing that I want to add. Okay, so Grandma Tippy Toes asked, is there any cathartic value at all for the 2 minutes of hate? And I wanted to circle back around to this because I actually think...
What a great question.
It is a great question, but it's very dangerous, because what catharsis does is it lets steam out of the valve, all right? Let's pressure out. That sometimes that pressure needs to be there for constructive action. And that the society right now gives us these little outlets so that we don't create a revolution, basically. They are playing us like a violin. So, they give us social media, they give us a certain freedom of expressions now. So just to keep us peasants quiet and Brennan circuses, basically. And I think that we have to get, we can't take the bait. We have to let that feeling of discontent, deeper discontent, to rise within us so that we can be truly brave facing what's ahead of us.
Wow. Can I have the globe?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I have two quick things here at the end. It's fantastic. It's really a great point, and a fantastic question, by the way, there about, can this 2 minutes hate have catharsis? And of course, we've all engaged on some level in 2 minutes hate. That's why it exists there. But I think we've seen incredible, we're incredibly wrapped up in this in the independent media, and we know what Catherine Austin Fitts calls the shriekometer on the mainstream side. So it's there, it's flowing all the time. And so we have to be, I think, extremely careful about getting drawn in. At one point, Ouspensky had made the observation during the Russian Revolution about what some of the revolutionaries were doing, and he said they run the risk of becoming insignificant slanderers. And it was something about this term. And I was like, this is the important thing. If you are to speak truth to power, that is one level of expressing actual real truth. But the 2 minutes hate thing actually works. It keeps everyone in that kind of proletarian cycle. Well, I told him, and it doesn't get anywhere. So it's a very interesting trick in that sense. That's why they use it. And of course, Orwell knew these things from his travels and just understanding how the Stalin regime and Hitler and all the rest of it worked, that he was able to look out into the future and say, this is what they're going to do. They're going to give us this 2 minutes hate. And we see it all over YouTube all the time. And that's our domain. I expect it in a sense from the Rachel Maddows and that kind of junk. But in this independent realm, I think we can do better. And that's a major goal. I want to give out a couple of interesting awards here at the very end of this show. The first award, it's unexpected to announce it, so I don't have his article here, but John Greenwald's work in 2019 exposing the TTSA at the Black Vault and going directly to the Pentagon officers and showing us that Dana White, who was the original Pentagon spokesperson who was fired for bribery, that this person was the only, and I mean the only official source for the entire To the Stars Academy fake story about ATIP and Elizondo leading ATIP. And that came about through John Greenwald going through a lot of flack over at the Black Vault. And he deserves Researcher of the Year, in my opinion, for 2019. So I'm giving it to him. And this glove here is the glove that Gigi Young gets for KO of Corey Good in just 1 minute and 45 seconds. I've never seen anyone run faster from an interaction in my life. So Gigi, unbelievable. And I always say it that there's no greater ally or friend to the X series than Gigi. And the work tonight, incredible stuff. And I know it'll stay with people for a very long time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and great awards. And it's been my pleasure. And thank you for having me.
Awesome. And again, everyone can go to gigiyoung.com to get up to date on all of the things that Gigi's doing. Her incredible series there, In Plain Sight, is on YouTube. Check it out. Absolutely fascinating themes getting covered. Next week, well, here we are. Actually, we're going to have some very interesting episodes coming up and some fascinating revelations that came about over the last 10 days that I was able to get an interview and a conversation with. So we're going to be putting out that interview shortly. I'm not going to say who it's with, but it's quite remarkable. And we will see you with that.
I have some super chatters to
Yes. Oh, yes.
So outstanding night tonight, by the way.
Great.
Michael Collier, Matt M., Sam Raven, Eurythmy is Fun, Charles Marlowe, Scabtree Scabby, Sacred Forest, Jessa Lynn, Angela Hawk, Aether, is very generous, and GDNPB. Thank you so much.
Remarkable. Well, and thank you for the support of the show. It really makes our job a lot easier and helps us get deep with this work, and it makes all the difference. So thank you. You can go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. That's available to you. You can become a subscriber and support our work through 2020. We've made it very affordable.
Yep, we're not changing the price right now.
And right, absolutely. But it's interesting too, because we want as many people to be able to come on board as possible. So we've made it.
We have something very exciting up our sleeve.
As per usual, but don't give it away just yet.
Nope, not yet.
And we will see everyone next week. And on Friday, we'll have, as I said, this very special interview. And thank you so much for joining us on to a very happy, healthy 2020. And Gigi Young is going to be a big piece of that and a big part of that going forward. So Gigi, thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Good night, guys.
Okay,
Thanks,
we'll
Gigi.
see you soon. And everyone, I want to do a few shout outs here, including, hey, it's Olivia Wings Girl. Now you're talking. Grandma Tippy Toast, it's great to see you out there. Sam Raven, great questions. John, great to see you. Rika, the hopeful voluntarist, I knew you must be out there. It's great to see you. And I know that we had Carly from Dimensions helping us with the chat earlier. Kate was out there. It's great to see you. Plan B, great to see you. Gaia Sophia, Adam Riddle, wow, outstanding. The Eighth Sphere, Armand, the battle is on 2020.
Scarlet Fire says, your show is the best.
That's great. And Miss Olivia, you did outstanding in 2019.
Thank you. This was a great show.
And tonight you did really great.
This was our third January 1st, New Year's show with Gigi, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true, actually, because
And
we did, yes.
It's
become a tradition.
It was my first show. Moderating.
That's
With
great.
Gigi that time.
So this is your then 2-year anniversary.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Unbelievable. Scruple.
So should I give a little spoiler alert at the end here?
No.
I'm going to do it. So David Termina said, okay, anybody who doesn't want to know about the new Star Wars movie, plug your ears up. So at the end of Rise of Skywalker,
Okay.
I'm doing it.
All right.
Rey defeats the Emperor by crossing 2 lightsabers in the form of an X.
Yes, the X steganography alive in 2020. Well, this is where it's going, and it's very interesting with the X aspect, because the more you study it, the more it seems to show up and reveal itself. So that's very much, I consider it as a modern touchstone, like the Rosetta Stone, basically. And it's interesting to me because I think this is something we're creating together, this kind of unveiling of this very ancient symbol. So everyone in the Ideas Room, thank you for a great 2019. Now we're deep into 2020 on the first day, and we're going to have some of the most incredible X-Series shows coming up for you. And it's great to have you here, and thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
And on Friday, remember, something special. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
And it says end the broadcast, but never really ends.